After years of relentless trials and impossible choices, Odysseus finally returns to the shores of Ithaca, but what awaits him is not the peaceful homecoming he envisioned. In the heart of a kingdom on the brink of collapse, the true cost of his journey is revealed, and the legacy of a hero is tested like never before. The gods assembled in the great hall of Olympus, a quiet tension hanging in the air as they gathered to discuss a matter that had long troubled them. Odysseus, the wily king of Ithaca, had been trapped on the island of Ogygia for what seemed an eternity, held captive by the nymph Calypso, who had fallen deeply in love with him. His fate was uncertain, and his home, Ithaca, lay in ruin. Athena, daughter of Zeus, could no longer bear the sight of his prolonged suffering. With grace, Athena stood, her bright eyes filled with urgency, and addressed the assembly. "Father," she said, turning to Zeus, "it has been years since Odysseus has been abandoned by the gods of Olympus. His journey home has been interrupted by forces beyond his control. You, who hold the fates of men and gods alike in your hands, must act. Release him from Calypso's grasp. He has suffered enough." Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of truth, and her plea echoed in the hearts of those who heard it. Zeus, the king of the gods, looked down from his throne with a furrowed brow. He was not unmoved by Athena's words, but he considered the situation carefully. Odysseus has long defied the gods, and his journey home has been fraught with hardship. It is not without reason that he has been delayed for so long. His voice was heavy with the wisdom of ages, yet his gaze softened when it landed on his daughter. "However, I will not ignore your plea. It is time for the hero to return to his destiny." At Zeus's command, Hermes, the swift messenger god, rose from his place. "Go to Calypso and bid her release Odysseus," Zeus instructed. "The fates have spoken, and the man must be free to fulfill his journey. His return is not merely a matter of homecoming, but of the balance that must be restored." Without a word, Hermes bowed and took flight, his winged sandals carrying him swiftly across the skies. His mission was clear, but he knew that the nymph would not part with Odysseus willingly. As he made his way toward Ogygia, the sea stretching beneath him, he felt the weight of the task ahead. Calypso, for all her love for the man, would not easily release him from her island sanctuary. But the will of the gods was absolute, and Odysseus's fate had been set in motion. Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, sat brooding in the grand hall of his father's house, his mind weighed down with frustration. The suitors, those arrogant men who had taken residence in his home, had grown bolder with each passing day. They plundered his father's wealth, consuming the food and drink without remorse, as they courted his mother, Penelope, with false promises and empty words. The sight of them, lounging without care, filled him with a deep, gnawing anger. He could bear it no longer. He rose from his seat and called for an assembly, his voice ringing clear in the hall. The nobles of Ithaca gathered, curiosity flickering in their eyes. For the first time, Telemachus, though young, would speak as a leader, and his voice would not be one of meekness, but of resolve. "My father is gone, and these men dishonor his name. They have made my house a mockery, and they show no respect for me or for my mother. The time has come for action," he declared, his chest swelling with the weight of his words. The elders of Ithaca, wise and weathered by years of leadership, turned their eyes upon Telemachus, the boy who had grown into a man before their very eyes. Some murmured in agreement, but others, cautious as ever, urged restraint. "The suitors are powerful," one elder warned. "What can we do against such numbers?" But Telemachus, burning with the righteousness of his cause, would not be dissuaded. "It is not power I seek," he said firmly, "but justice. These men have overstepped, and I will not stand idle while they destroy my father's legacy." His words rang with such determination that even the elders were silenced, their doubts quelled by the fire in his voice. He turned to them now, his eyes ablaze with a new purpose. "I will go in search of news about my father, for no man can stand against what we do not understand." I will go to Pylos and to Sparta, to the great kings who once fought beside Odysseus. If anyone knows where he is, or what has become of him, I will find out. I will not return until I know the truth." The assembly listened, their hearts stirred by Telemachus's resolve. Penelope, though unaware of her son's decision, had felt the weight of these years, the years of waiting for Odysseus. And though the suitors still consumed her home, a glimmer of hope sparked in her heart. Perhaps, after all, her son would return as the man his father had once been, strong, wise, and unyielding. Telemachus prepared to leave that very day, knowing the path before him would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. But in that moment, he no longer felt like the helpless boy who had once waited for his father's return. He was a son of Odysseus, and the time had come for him to take up the mantle of leadership. His journey would begin now, and he would seek the truth no matter where it led. Telemachus set out from Ithaca with a heart heavy with questions and a mind set on finding the truth about his father. His journey to Pylos was long and tiring, but he carried within him the hope of finding answers. Pylos, a rich and ancient city, stood along the coast, and it was there that King Nestor, an old hero of the Trojan War, ruled. Telemachus had heard tales of Nestor's wisdom and bravery, and it was to him that he would turn in search of knowledge. As Telemachus approached the city, he saw the grand sight of Nestor's palace. Nestled on the shores, where the smoke of sacrifices rose to the gods, the young prince, with his heart pounding, walked through the gates, guided by a sense of destiny. Nestor's house was grand, and within it, the air was thick with the smell of burning offerings, for the king was making sacrifices to Poseidon, the god of the sea. Telemachus approached the king's hearth, where Nestor sat with his sons and attendants. Nestor welcomed Telemachus warmly, sensing the young man's resolve, and bade him sit. The king asked of his journey, noting that it was unusual for a prince so young to come seeking wisdom so far from home. Telemachus, with great respect, spoke of his father, Odysseus, and the plight that had kept him from his homeland for so many years. He asked Nestor if he had heard any word of Odysseus's fate. Nestor, his face creased with age and wisdom, sighed deeply, his thoughts turning to the past. He began to recount the story of the heroes who had fought at Troy, their long journeys home after the war had ended. He told Telemachus of the battles, the hardships, and the twists of fate that had befallen each of the Greek kings as they sought to return to their lands. He spoke of Agamemnon, who was murdered upon his return by his wife and her lover, and of Menelaus, who had struggled to return to Sparta. He told of the great sacrifices and the anger of the gods that had delayed their homecoming. Yet of Odysseus, the hero of Ithaca, Nestor spoke with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. He recalled how Odysseus had left Troy full of hope, eager to return to his family, but the gods had not been kind to him. Nestor told of the great hardships Odysseus faced on his journey, how he had angered Poseidon and had been delayed by countless obstacles, and how, despite his brilliance, he had yet to find his way home. Telemachus listened intently, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his father's return was no simple matter, and that even the greatest of heroes could not always defy the will of the gods. Nestor then offered what comfort he could, advising Telemachus to seek further knowledge from Menelaus in Sparta, for he might have heard something more of Odysseus. With these words, Telemachus prepared to continue his journey, his spirit strengthened by Nestor's tales, but still burdened with the mystery of his father's fate. Telemachus's journey took him next to Sparta, where the grandeur of Menelaus's palace struck him with awe. The city, vibrant and alive, seemed a world apart from the quiet streets of Ithaca. Upon arrival, Telemachus was greeted with kindness by Menelaus and his wife, Helen, both legendary figures of the Trojan War. Their home was filled with the warmth of a family reunion, yet there was a sorrow in the air that matched Telemachus's own troubled heart. Menelaus welcomed Telemachus with open arms, immediately sensing the purpose behind the young prince's visit. He invited him to dine with them, and, over a lavish meal, began to recount the long and painful story of the Greeks' return from Troy. The hero of the tale, as ever, was Odysseus, whose name lingered in the air like an old, familiar song. Helen, too, spoke with admiration of the great king of Ithaca, recalling the war and the men who fought in it. She told of the Trojan horse, the moment of victory, and the bittersweet departure of the Greek armies from the shores of Troy. Menelaus, his face clouded with the weight of time, went on to recount the trials each hero faced upon returning home. The gods, it seemed, had delighted in tormenting them. He spoke of his own journey, how he had been stranded in Egypt, facing trials of his own before finally returning to Sparta. But it was Odysseus's journey that seemed to haunt him the most. Menelaus spoke of the countless difficulties Odysseus had faced after the war, how the gods, particularly Poseidon, had conspired to keep him from his home. Telemachus hung on every word, his heart swelling with both pride and sorrow as the story unfolded. It was then that Menelaus, after a pause, revealed the most important news that Telemachus had hoped for but feared to hear. Odysseus was alive. The hero had been trapped on the island of Ogygia with the nymph Calypso, who had kept him captive for years. Though the gods had decreed his release, Odysseus was still far from home, stranded in a situation far beyond his control. Menelaus shared how he had encountered Proteus, the ancient sea god, during his own wanderings, and how Proteus had told him of Odysseus's plight. The words stung Telemachus, but they also ignited a flame of hope. His father was not dead, as he had feared, but alive somewhere across the seas. Yet the path to Ithaca seemed as distant and uncertain as ever. Menelaus advised Telemachus to return to Ithaca and prepare for his father's homecoming, for the gods would eventually guide Odysseus back. Though Telemachus still had much to learn, the knowledge that his father was alive gave him the strength to continue his quest. With new resolve, Telemachus bade farewell to Menelaus and Helen, and set his sights on home, his heart heavy but filled with the possibility of reunion. Odysseus had spent many long years on the island of Ogygia, held captive by the nymph Calypso. Though she was kind to him, offering him comfort and even love, Odysseus's heart ached with the desire to return to his homeland, to Ithaca, and to his wife, Penelope. His days on the island had blurred into one long stretch of waiting, the seasons passing without hope. He had lost count of the years, yet his longing for home remained as fierce as the first day he was stranded. In the heavens, the gods watched Odysseus's plight with mixed emotions. Zeus, king of the gods, had been sympathetic to the hero's suffering, yet it was Poseidon, the god of the sea, who had kept Odysseus from returning home. Despite this, Zeus could not ignore the pleas of Athena, who had taken a particular liking to Odysseus and his cunning. She argued that enough was enough, that the hero had endured enough hardship, and that it was time for him to return to his family. At Zeus's command, Hermes, the messenger god, was dispatched to Ogygia to deliver the decree that would change Odysseus's fate. When Hermes arrived on the island, he found Calypso tending to her garden, her golden hair flowing like the waves around her. She greeted Hermes with the respect due to a god, but when she heard the message, her face darkened. Zeus had ordered that she release Odysseus. Calypso, though deeply in love with the hero, knew she could not defy the will of the gods. She had no choice but to obey. Calypso appeared before Odysseus, her sadness reflected in her eyes. She told him of Zeus's command and of the god's desire for his release. Odysseus, though overwhelmed with joy at the prospect of leaving, did not rush to thank her. Instead, he quietly weighed the gift of freedom. Calypso, understanding his hesitation, assured him that she bore him no ill will. With a heavy heart, she agreed to help him build a raft, offering him provisions and the tools needed for the voyage. For days, Odysseus labored, building a sturdy raft to carry him across the sea. Calypso, though reluctant to see him go, did everything in her power to aid his departure, and the day came when the raft was ready. Calypso, with one last touch of tenderness, bade him farewell, telling him to remember her and the island they had shared. Odysseus set sail, his heart torn between his love for Calypso and his burning desire to return to Ithaca. As he drifted from the shores of Ogygia, the familiar scent of the sea filled his lungs, and the winds seemed to promise that his long journey home had finally begun. Odysseus's journey had taken him far from the comforts of home, and after many hardships at sea, he found himself shipwrecked on a strange and unfamiliar shore. The storm that Poseidon had sent to punish him had torn his raft to pieces, and he was cast adrift until, exhausted and nearly drowned, he washed up on the island of the Phaeacians. The land was lush and green, with the scent of salt water and wildflowers hanging heavy in the air. The island seemed peaceful, a stark contrast to the violent waves that had thrown him there. As Odysseus staggered to his feet, gasping for breath, he saw a group of young women washing clothes by a stream. Among them was Nausicaa, the daughter of King Alcinous and Queen Arete. She was strikingly beautiful, her golden hair shining like the sun, and she was dressed in a simple yet elegant gown. Her presence, graceful and calm, stood in stark contrast to Odysseus, who was covered in brine and dirt from his tumultuous journey. She was the first person he encountered on the island, and it was she who would change the course of his fate. Nausicaa, startled at first by the sight of the disheveled stranger, quickly realized that he was no ordinary man. Despite his ragged appearance, there was a certain dignity about him that impressed her. Odysseus, with all his strength, managed to speak, though his voice was hoarse. He pleaded for help, telling her of the hardships he had endured, and begged her to take pity on him. Nausicaa, moved by his plight, showed compassion. She instructed her maids to give him food, clothing, and a place to rest. She knew her father's court would be the only place where Odysseus could find refuge. She advised him to wait until nightfall, so that the townspeople would not see him in his ragged state. Then, she led him to the palace, guiding him through the lush gardens and winding paths. As they walked, Nausicaa spoke of her family, her homeland, and her dreams for the future. Odysseus, ever the listener, was careful not to overstep his place, though he could not help but notice the kindness in her eyes and the grace with which she carried herself. When they reached the court, Nausicaa presented Odysseus to her parents, King Alcinous and Queen Arete. The royal couple, renowned for their wisdom and hospitality, welcomed Odysseus with open arms. They offered him food and shelter, promising that he would be helped on his journey home. As he sat at their table, Odysseus could feel the warmth of their generosity and knew that, for the first time in many years, he had found a safe haven. Though the journey ahead would still be long and filled with challenges, Odysseus had at last been granted the chance to recover and, perhaps, to find his way home. Odysseus, now bathed and clothed in the finest garments, sat at the table of King Alcinous, surrounded by the splendor of the Phaeacian court. His heart, heavy with the weight of his long journey, felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. The Phaeacians, known for their kindness and wealth, welcomed him as one of their own, offering food, wine, and music. The court was filled with laughter and merriment, the sound of lyres and flutes drifting through the air, as if the very atmosphere was meant to lift his spirits. Odysseus was deeply moved by their generosity. King Alcinous, a wise and fair ruler, saw the weariness in Odysseus's eyes and, after a time, spoke kindly to him. He promised that the Phaeacians would help him return to his homeland, Ithaca. The king's words were a balm to Odysseus's soul, for it had been a long and painful road since he had last set foot in his kingdom. Alcinous offered him a ship and crew, ensuring that he would be delivered safely home. But before any of that could happen, the Phaeacians needed to hear Odysseus's story. They were eager to know about the legendary hero who had suffered so much and faced countless trials. The people gathered eagerly around the royal hall, eyes wide with curiosity. Odysseus hesitated for a moment, wondering how to begin. but the hospitality of the court encouraged him to speak. He took a deep breath and began recounting the tale of his journey, starting with the fall of Troy. As he spoke, Odysseus wove his tale with great care, recounting the many adventures he had faced, the gods who had aided and hindered him, and the monstrous creatures he had battled. His words were filled with both sorrow and pride, as each story carried with it the weight of loss, courage, and survival. He spoke of the Cyclops, of Circe's enchantments, of the harrowing journey to the underworld, and the deadly temptations of the sirens. Each moment of his journey was vivid in his mind, and he shared it all, revealing the depth of his endurance and the trials that had shaped him. The Phaeacians listened intently, entranced by the hero's words. His tale seemed almost impossible to believe, yet the sincerity in his voice and the pain in his eyes made it clear that every word was true. The more he spoke, the more the Phaeacians admired him. Their hearts swelled with respect for the man who had endured so much, and in their eyes, he became more than just a stranger seeking help. He was a hero, a figure of legend whose fate had been entwined with the gods themselves. When Odysseus finished his story, the entire court was silent for a moment, as if taking in the magnitude of his experiences. King Alcinous, moved by the hero's plight, promised once again that he would see him safely back to Ithaca. With that promise made, Odysseus could finally rest, knowing that his journey, long and fraught with struggle, was drawing near its end. Odysseus, seated before the eager Phaeacian court, took a moment to gather his thoughts. The warmth of their hospitality settled over him, a stark contrast to the cold, endless years of wandering. The fire crackled softly in the background as he prepared to recount the tale of his journey, a journey that had spanned a decade and cost him more than he had ever imagined. He began with the fall of Troy, that fateful city where he and his comrades had fought for 10 long years. The Greeks had emerged victorious, but the victory came at a terrible price. He spoke of their joyous departure from the ruins of Troy, their hearts filled with the hope of returning home to their families, to the lands they had fought so hard to protect. But that hope, like so many others on his journey, would soon be dashed. The gods, it seemed, had other plans. Odysseus paused for a moment, reflecting on the wrath of Poseidon, who had not forgiven him for blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. He told the Phaeacians of how his ship had been driven off course by storms, the wrath of the gods ever present on the horizon. The winds that had once carried them to safety now turned against them, hurling them toward the unknown. His men, weary and disheartened, had begun to lose hope, but Odysseus had pressed on, determined to see Ithaca once more. His voice grew heavy as he spoke of the first island they encountered, the land of the Cicones. He told of how his men, eager for spoils, had pillaged the city, only to be met with fierce resistance. The Cicones had rallied their forces, and the Greeks had been driven back, suffering great losses in the process. Odysseus's frustration was palpable as he described the consequences of their greed, the price they paid for not heeding his counsel. From there, the journey only grew more perilous. He spoke of the lotus eaters, whose fruit caused men to forget their homes and their purpose. He spoke of the terrible Cyclops, Polyphemus, whose cave had become a prison for Odysseus and his men. The tale of how they had outwitted the giant, blinding him in his sleep, was met with awe by the Phaeacians. Odysseus's cleverness and courage were clear in his recounting, but even in his triumph, he could not escape the gods' vengeance. The story, though still early in its telling, had already begun to reveal the depth of Odysseus's suffering. Each island, each trial, each encounter had chipped away at him and his men, yet the hero remained resolute, driven by the hope of one day returning to Ithaca. He paused, his voice softening as he glanced at the faces of the Phaeacians. Their eyes were wide with wonder and sympathy, the weight of his journey settling upon them. The tale had only just begun, but Odysseus knew the worst was still to come. The Phaeacians, however, hung on every word, captivated by the hero before them, who had survived where so many others had fallen. Odysseus's voice grew somber as he continued his tale, the memory of the Cyclops haunting him still. He spoke of the island of the Cyclops, a land that seemed untouched by the gods or by civilization. It was a rugged, desolate place, inhabited by giant creatures, each living alone in their caves. The Greeks, weary from their travels, had hoped for a warm meal and a safe rest, but they were met with something far more dangerous than they had imagined. The island appeared to be uninhabited by men, and so Odysseus and his crew ventured inland, seeking food and shelter. It wasn't long before they came upon the cave of a Cyclops. The giant, Polyphemus, lived in isolation, his only company the sheep he tended. He was a towering, monstrous figure, his single eye glaring out from the center of his forehead like some dark omen. The men, though cautious, were eager for a feast, so they entered the cave, hoping for hospitality. What they did not know was that the Cyclops had no sense of hospitality, for he had no regard for the laws of men or gods. Odysseus recounted how they waited for the Cyclops to return, not knowing what to expect. When Polyphemus finally arrived, his immense size shook the ground beneath him. He blocked the entrance to the cave, trapping them inside. The giant then asked who they were and what they wanted. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, replied with charm, offering a gift in exchange for the giant's hospitality. But Polyphemus, his heart as hard as stone, was not interested in such formalities. Instead, he grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, crushed them in his hands, and ate them, savoring their flesh. The horror of that moment was etched into Odysseus's memory, but it was also, in that moment, that his cunning came into play. He knew that brute force would not win the day. Instead, he began to weave a plan. He told the Cyclops that his name was Nobody, a clever ruse that would serve him well in the coming hours. Then, he offered Polyphemus wine, intoxicating the giant with the strongest drink they had. Polyphemus, drunk and groggy, fell asleep in his cave, leaving himself vulnerable. With a silent command, Odysseus and his men took the sharpest spear they could find and fashioned it into a brutal weapon. They drove it into Polyphemus's single eye while he slept, blinding him in an agonizing, earth-shattering moment. The giant, now blind and furious, screamed out in agony, calling for help from his fellow Cyclopes. But when his neighbors arrived and asked who was attacking him, Polyphemus could only shout, "Nobody!" They, confused and unable to help, left him alone. As the days passed, Odysseus and his men devised a plan to escape. They tied themselves to the bellies of the Cyclops sheep, knowing that the blinded giant would not be able to see them when he let his flock out to graze. As Polyphemus released his sheep, they followed, hiding under the wool, and successfully escaped his grasp. Though victorious, Odysseus could not resist calling out to the Cyclops from the safety of his ship, revealing his true name. In his hubris, he sealed his fate. Polyphemus, now enraged, called upon his father, Poseidon, cursing Odysseus and ensuring that the hero's journey home would be even more perilous than before. Odysseus's voice lowered, his gaze distant as he remembered their encounter with Aeolus, the god of the winds. After escaping the island of the Cyclopes, they sailed on, weary but hopeful that they might at last make their way back to Ithaca. Their journey brought them to the island of Aeolus, where the wind god resided in a grand palace atop a rocky mountain. Aeolus, pleased with their perseverance and moved by their plight, received them warmly. He listened to their story, offering them a gift that would speed their return to their homeland. Aeolus, with his knowledge of the seas and the winds, handed Odysseus a large leather bag. Inside it were the winds, which, if used wisely, could guide them home. He instructed them to sail with the favorable winds, keeping the bag closed. If they followed his advice, he promised, they would be carried swiftly and directly to Ithaca. With that, he sent them on their way, confident that the gift would help them overcome the final stretch of their journey. For a while, everything seemed to go well. The winds, confined within their bag, worked in their favor, propelling their ship forward with remarkable speed. Odysseus, feeling the weight of his fate finally shifting in his favor, allowed himself to relax, though he remained cautious. His men, however, were not so patient. They had seen the bag, full of mystery, hanging at the side of the ship, and whispers began to circulate among the crew. Why would Odysseus keep such a gift for himself? They wondered, especially when the winds could so easily carry them home. Their curiosity grew, and with it, a gnawing sense of greed. One night, as Odysseus slept, exhausted from the strain of leadership and worry, his men, overcome by temptation, opened the bag. The moment they did, the winds exploded out, howling with fury. A great storm surged in response, and the ship was cast violently off course. The winds, no longer contained, swept the ship away from Ithaca, back into the wild and unpredictable seas. When Odysseus awoke to the chaos, he immediately understood the disaster that had occurred. His heart sank as he realized what his men had done. The bag that had once held the key to their homecoming had now become their undoing. They had been so close, so tantalizingly close to reaching their destination, and now they were once again at the mercy of the relentless winds. Odysseus, filled with frustration and sorrow, could only watch as the storm carried them further from their goal. The gods, it seemed, were still playing their cruel game with him, and he felt the weight of his misfortune once again. As the ship was blown farther from the shore, he could only wonder if the gods themselves had decided to punish him, or if he and his men had simply fallen prey to their own hubris. Regardless, the journey was far from over, and Odysseus knew that the worst was yet to come. Odysseus, weary and despondent after being driven off course by the winds, was faced with yet another daunting task: to seek the counsel of the dead. The journey took him to the desolate land of the underworld, where he would consult the blind prophet Tiresias, whose wisdom could guide him through the dangers that lay ahead. He had been instructed by Circe, the sorceress, to perform certain rites in order to summon the spirits of the dead. Only by doing so could he gain the crucial knowledge he needed to complete his journey and return to Ithaca. When Odysseus arrived at the shores of the dark, foreboding river, he performed the rites that Circe had taught him. He dug a trench and poured libations of milk, honey, wine, and water, then sprinkled barley on the ground. As he prayed, the spirits of the dead began to rise from the earth, their ghostly forms emerging one by one. The air grew thick with their whispers and wails, but Odysseus stood firm, ready for the answers that might save him. The first to approach was the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet, who, even in death, possessed a keen vision of the future. Odysseus, desperate for guidance, asked Tiresias how he might find his way home and what fate awaited him. Tiresias, though a mere shadow of his former self, spoke with unwavering authority. He warned Odysseus of the trials yet to come, cautioning him that he would face immense challenges before reaching Ithaca, challenges that would test not only his strength but his resolve. Tiresias told Odysseus that he would return to his homeland, but not without great cost. He would find his home overrun by suitors vying for his wife Penelope's hand. To reclaim it, Odysseus would have to confront them with both his cunning and his might. Tiresias also warned him of the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios, which he must avoid. If his men harmed these cattle, they would bring ruin upon themselves and delay their homecoming for even longer. The prophet spoke gravely, telling Odysseus that the gods were watching, and that only by showing restraint and reverence for the divine would he be able to survive. As Odysseus listened intently to Tiresias's words, he felt a deep sense of foreboding. Yet, the prophet's counsel also gave him a sliver of hope. He would need to be careful, to think beyond the immediate temptations that would arise during his journey. There would be no room for mistakes, no time for error. Tiresias made it clear, Odysseus's survival depended not just on his bravery, but on his understanding of the god's will. After the prophet finished speaking, Odysseus tried to ask more questions, but Tiresias' shade began to fade back into the depths of the underworld. Odysseus, now armed with the knowledge of the dangers ahead, could do little but prepare himself for the trials that would follow. As the spirits continued to gather around him, he knew that his path to Ithaca was fraught with peril, and that only by staying true to Tiresias's guidance could he hope to survive the wrath of the gods and reclaim his home. Odysseus and his men sailed onward, their spirits tested by the endless trials they had faced. Yet ahead lay one of the most dangerous stretches of their journey, an area where few ships had passed without disaster. The sea was filled with peril. The sirens, whose songs enchanted sailors into crashing their ships onto the rocks, and the terrifying monsters Scylla and Charybdis, both creatures of unimaginable fury. To navigate these threats, Odysseus had been warned by Circe, but even knowing the dangers ahead could not fully prepare him for what awaited. As they approached the island of the Sirens, Odysseus ordered his men to block their ears with beeswax so that the haunting songs could not reach them. Yet, he himself, curious and determined to hear the creatures' voices, commanded that he be tied to the mast of the ship. With his men rowing onward, the siren's song began to float on the breezes sweet, irresistible, promising knowledge and pleasures beyond imagining. Their voices beckoned, speaking of Troy's fall, of heroes long gone, and of secrets hidden in the depths of the sea. Odysseus struggled against the ropes that bound him, pleading with his men to release him. But they obeyed his earlier orders, refusing to untie him no matter how loudly he begged. His desire to hear their song was overpowering, but he understood too well the danger it posed. The ship surged forward, the siren's melody fading as they sailed past. Finally, when the song was no longer audible, Odysseus was freed from his bonds, shaken by the close call, but grateful to have escaped the creature's grasp. Yet, even as the threat of the sirens passed, a new danger loomed ahead. Circe had warned him of the twin monsters Scylla, a hideous beast with 12 legs and 6 heads, and Charybdis, a whirlpool that swallowed entire ships in a single gulp. Odysseus steered the ship carefully, trying to avoid both, but Scylla, with her sharp, hungry jaws, was too quick. As they passed through the narrow strait, the monster struck. 6 of Odysseus' bravest men were snatched away, their screams cut short as they were devoured by the terrifying heads of Scylla. Odysseus, heartbroken but resolute, kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, unwilling to let the loss of his men break his will. Just as the ship emerged from the deadly strait, the relentless force of Charybdis pulled at the ship's stern, threatening to drag it into the abyss. But with a final, desperate effort, Odysseus and his remaining crew managed to row hard enough to escape the pull of the whirlpool, narrowly avoiding certain doom. Though they had survived these dangers, Odysseus knew the cost. His crew had lost yet more men, and the challenges of their journey were far from over. But they had made it through the worst, and for the time being, the sea was calm again. Still, as they sailed on, Odysseus understood that the gods had set trials before him that would continue to test his resolve and the lives of his men until his journey's end. After all, the hardships and the near destruction of his men, Odysseus finally saw the familiar coastline of Ithaca on the horizon. His heart swelled with emotion as his homeland came into view, but he knew that his journey was far from over. He had been away for nearly 20 years, and the situation at home was far more complicated than he could have imagined. His palace was overrun by suitors, men who had taken advantage of his long absence and vied for his wife Penelope's hand. His son Telemachus had grown into a young man, but had been left to deal with the insolent suitors on his own. Odysseus, weary from his long voyage, realized that before he could reveal himself, he must first understand the full scope of the chaos that had gripped his home. Guided by Athena's wisdom, Odysseus disguised himself as a beggar upon his return, masking his identity so he could secretly assess the situation, without revealing himself to the suitors or anyone else in the palace. The transformation was complete, and he stepped ashore as a man who had seen far too much suffering. wearing the rags of a wanderer. Athena, ever the protector, had made sure that his appearance was altered and his true form was hidden from the eyes of all but the gods. The first place he went was to the hut of Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd. There, he was given shelter and food, though Eumaeus had no idea who his guest truly was. Odysseus, in his disguise, carefully measured the loyalty of the few remaining servants on the island, wondering who would remain faithful to him and who had been corrupted by the suitors' bribes. He marveled at how much time had passed, and yet how little his home had truly changed in essence. The land was still as beautiful as he remembered, but the trust he once had in the people around him had crumbled in his absence. He then travelled to his own palace, still unrecognized, walking with caution. The halls were filled with laughter and noise, the sound of the suitors gorging themselves on his wealth and offering disdainful glances at his wife. Penelope, though beset by grief, had remained true to him, refusing to marry any of the suitors despite their pressure. She did not yet know that her husband had returned, but she, too, had not given up hope. The pain of being apart for so long weighed heavily on both of them. Odysseus, hidden from view, steeled himself for what would come next. He had seen enough to know that only by revealing his true identity, through cunning and resolve, could he reclaim his home and restore order. But for now, he remained hidden in the shadows, a beggar in his own house, waiting for the right moment to act. The time had come to take back what was his. Odysseus, still cloaked in the rags of a beggar, made his way through the familiar paths of Ithaca, his heart heavy with the weight of his long absence. His steps were slow, cautious, as he approached the humble hut of Eumaeus, the swineherd, the only man he truly trusted on the island. The swineherd had always been loyal, steadfast in his service to Odysseus during the long years of peace, and Odysseus was eager to gauge the depth of that loyalty now that he had returned, though in disguise. As he reached the door, he hesitated, taking a deep breath, feeling the bitter winds of his past and the promise of revenge stirring in his chest. With a quiet knock, he entered the hut, greeted by the sight of Eumaeus tending to his fire and the pigs. The warmth of the hearth was inviting, and Odysseus could sense the swineherd's hard work in the simple comforts of the small dwelling. Eumaeus looked up, his face weathered and kind. His eyes filled with the weariness of a man who had spent many years working the land alone. "Stranger," he said, his voice low, "you seem weary and hungry. Come, sit by the fire. The gods have sent you to me, and I will treat you as any guest deserves." Odysseus, in his beggar guise, accepted the offer gratefully, though his heart ached with the knowledge of the years lost. He sat by the fire, allowing the warmth to fill his bones, and for a moment he felt a sense of homecoming. Eumaeus set a bowl of food before him, offering bread and roasted meat, and Odysseus ate with the hunger of a man who had spent far too long away from his people. As they ate, Eumaeus spoke of Ithaca's troubles in the absence of its king. "The suitors, they come and go, like wolves at the door," he said, with a sigh, shaking his head. "Your house has been taken over, and your wife, Penelope, suffers. Yet, still, she waits for you, though the years have turned to dust." Odysseus's heart swelled with grief at the mention of Penelope, but he kept his face impassive. "Tell me," he asked, his voice trembling with controlled emotion, "what hope does she have? Do you still believe she waits for a man lost to the seas?" Eumaeus's eyes filled with a kind of wistfulness. "Aye," he replied, "she does, though many say she's a fool for it. She hasn't remarried, even with the pressure of the suitors. She still believes in you, in the man you were." The conversation lingered between them, with Odysseus listening intently as Eumaeus spoke of the kingdom's misfortune. Yet, even as the swineherd's words filled the air, Odysseus could not shake the feeling that he was sitting at the precipice of something far greater. His true identity was hidden, but the loyalty and love from the people who still believed in him, those who had held out hope for his return, was a fire that could never be extinguished. It was this that would fuel the final steps of his long journey home. Telemachus had returned to Ithaca, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and resolve. The news of his father's survival had ignited a fire within him that had burned brighter with each step he took toward home. His journey to Pylos and Sparta had given him the strength to face the truth, and now, as the island of Ithaca loomed before him, he knew the time for action had come. He could not allow the suitors to continue their insolent feasting in his father's halls. With the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, Telemachus dismounted from his ship, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. His mind raced with the knowledge that his father, Odysseus, was near, perhaps even watching from the shadows. Yet, Telemachus could not help but feel an overwhelming sense of uncertainty, as though the very island itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. He made his way to the hut of Eumaeus, the loyal swineherd, seeking the shelter of familiar faces. Eumaeus greeted him warmly, though there was a spark in his eyes, something that hinted at an unspoken truth. Telemachus, sensing that the moment had finally arrived, asked about his father's return, and as Eumaeus led him to the disguised figure sitting by the hearth, it became clear to him that this was not just any man who had found refuge in his home. The beggar sitting before him, dressed in tattered rags, raised his eyes to Telemachus, and for the briefest moment, their gazes locked. It was the same gaze that Telemachus had seen in his childhood memories, the same one he had longed for throughout his life. It was his father, Odysseus. "Father?" Telemachus whispered, his voice thick with disbelief, yet full of certainty. Odysseus, still cloaked in his beggar's disguise, nodded with a subtle smile, his voice low and steady. "It is me, my son. I have returned at last, but not yet in the way you might expect." Telemachus's eyes filled with tears of joy, and for a moment, all the years of separation seemed to vanish. He embraced his father, feeling the familiar strength of the man who had fought for him, for their family, for their kingdom. It was then that the gravity of their situation settled in, as Odysseus's words reminded him of the task that lay ahead. "We will deal with the suitors together," Odysseus said, his voice calm but firm. "But first, we must wait. Patience, my son, will be our greatest weapon. We will strike when the time is right, and they will not know what hit them." Telemachus, now standing by his father's side, understood. It was no longer a matter of merely confronting the suitors. It was about reclaiming their home, their legacy, and their place in Ithaca. The years of absence had hardened them both, but in that moment, their bond had never been stronger. Together, they would take back what was theirs. In the quiet shelter of the swineherd's hut, the reunion between father and son unfolded, though in silence at first. Telemachus, still processing the shock of finding his father alive and standing before him, held on to his father with a mix of wonder and disbelief. The words that Odysseus had spoken echoed in his mind, though they had yet to fully settle. Odysseus, now revealing his true identity, embraced his son with a quiet strength, a depth of love and sorrow hidden beneath the surface. The years of absence, the distance, the hardship, they had not dulled the bond between them, though it had shaped them both. Odysseus, though he had returned to the island of Ithaca, was no longer the same man who had once sailed for Troy. Telemachus, too, had transformed, growing in strength and courage throughout his journey to find the truth of his father's fate. Now, father and son stood together, facing not just their reunion, but the monumental task that awaited them. Telemachus pulled away slightly, looking at his father as if seeing him for the first time in a new light. His face softened, but there was a quiet resolve in his eyes. The suitors, who had overrun their home, had long taken what they pleased abusing Penelope's hospitality and making a mockery of the kingdom that was rightfully theirs. It was this recklessness that had driven Telemachus to leave Ithaca and search for answers. And now that Odysseus was here, he knew the time for action had come. "I have waited for this moment, father," Telemachus said, his voice steady, his grip tightening around his sword. But how? The suitors there are so many of them. Odysseus, his eyes glinting with a spark that only a man who had survived such trials could possess, leaned in closer. Patience, my son. They do not know yet who they are truly dealing with. He paused, as if weighing the gravity of what was about to unfold. I have returned to claim what is ours, but we must be clever. We will wait. Let them grow careless in their indulgence. Let them mock us, but when the time comes, we will strike as one. You and I. Telemachus nodded, understanding the wisdom in his father's words. The suitors had grown arrogant, thinking that Odysseus was lost forever. They had no idea that the man they mocked, the beggar they had scorned, was the very king they had long since displaced. They would soon learn that their fate had already been sealed. The father and son stood together, an unspoken agreement between them, a bond that would endure no matter the cost. The plan was set in motion. It was not just the kingdom of Ithaca that they sought to reclaim. It was their dignity, their legacy, their home. The suitors would pay, and the world would see once again that Odysseus and Telemachus were not to be underestimated. Odysseus placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride welling in his chest. We will take back what is ours, Telemachus, and we will do it together. Odysseus, still disguised as the beggar, stepped through the familiar gates of his palace, his heart heavy with both nostalgia and rage. The grand halls that once echoed with the sounds of his family's laughter now lay under the weight of dishonor. The suitors, lounging in the corners of the room, paid no mind to the ragged stranger who had stumbled in. To them, he was just another beggar, another insignificant figure to be ignored or mocked. The palace, once a symbol of his power and prosperity, had become a den of excess. The suitors drank wine from the finest goblets, laughing loudly and boasting of their feats, unaware of the man who had once commanded the very place they now desecrated. Odysseus felt the bile rise in his throat as he observed them, their shameless disregard for his home, for his wife, for his son. Penelope, ever the gracious queen, walked among them, forced to endure their lecherous advances, their crude jokes, and their endless demands. Her beauty had not faded, though her eyes carried the weariness of years spent waiting for a husband who may never return. Odysseus's heart clenched at the sight of her. He had known this woman all his life. He had watched her endure the trials of their kingdom, and now, here she was, trapped by these men who had no right to be in his house. He felt a surge of anger, but he remained still, careful to maintain his disguise. If they recognized him now, all would be lost. But he could not ignore the sight before him, the sight of his wealth being squandered, his home being desecrated, and his wife being taunted by men who had no respect for what she had endured. As he moved quietly through the halls, Odysseus noticed the way the suitors looked upon Penelope. Some of them, arrogant and drunk on their own power, seemed to think she was nothing more than a prize to be won. Others appeared more calculating, attempting to win her favor with lavish gifts or empty promises, all while belittling her late husband. One suitor, Antinous, stood out in his cruelty, his voice carrying across the room as he mocked Penelope's delay in choosing a husband. "When will you finally choose, lady?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Do you not see the quality of men who stand before you? The time for mourning is long past." Penelope's gaze, though weary, did not falter. She remained silent, her dignity intact, though Odysseus could see the weight of the years of waiting in her eyes. She had been patient. She had never wavered in her faith. Odysseus clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. The time for patience was over. His home, his kingdom, his wife, they were no longer theirs to take. He would deal with the suitors soon enough, but for now he had to watch, listen, and wait. The final act of revenge would be swift and sure. They would not see it coming. The noise in the hall grew louder as the suitors continued their revelry, mocking the beggar who had dared to enter their domain. They jeered at him, tossing scraps of food and laughter in his direction. The sight of him, ragged and weak, seemed to amuse them. and they took pleasure in his helplessness. Odysseus, however, remained calm, his gaze steady as he listened to their taunts. Among the suitors, a particularly arrogant one, Antinous, had been watching him closely. He stood tall, his eyes glinting with a mixture of scorn and amusement. "What, are you here to beg for scraps like the others?" Antinous sneered, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "If you want food, you'll have to fight for it." Odysseus felt the rage rise within him, but he quelled it with a deep breath. He had not come this far to reveal himself prematurely. Still, the insults were too much. He would not be mocked in his own house, not while they trampled on everything he had fought for. He had to show them, if only for a moment, that he was not the frail beggar they thought him to be. With a swift movement, Odysseus threw off the cloak of humility he had been wearing so well, and without warning, he grabbed a nearby stool and hurled it at Antinous. The force of the impact sent the suitor stumbling back, knocking a table over in the process. The room fell into stunned silence as the suitors gaped at the unexpected sight. Antinous stood, seething with anger, but Odysseus was quicker, his muscles honed by years of hardship. He lunged forward and grabbed Antinous by the throat, lifting him off the ground with ease. For a long moment, the two men struggled in the center of the hall, the suitors too stunned to intervene. Odysseus, though still disguised, fought with the fury of a lion defending its den. He had lived through wars, faced monsters, and survived God's wrath. This pitiful suitor, this fool, would not bring him down. Antinous struggled, gasping for air, but Odysseus tightened his grip, his rage burning in his chest. "You think you can mock me?" he spat. "You think you can come into my house and disrespect me, my wife, my son, my home?" The suitors began to murmur, their bravado faltering in the face of the beggar's unexpected strength. They were used to getting their way, used to having no consequences for their actions, but now they were forced to confront the man they had so casually disrespected. Finally, Odysseus released his grip, tossing Antinous to the floor with a thud. The suitor lay there, coughing and gasping, his face red with humiliation. Odysseus stood over him, his voice steady but filled with authority. "I may be a beggar, but I am still the master of this house," he said, "and you will show respect." The suitors, now wary, looked at one another, their confidence shaken. They had seen something in the beggar now, something that made them reconsider their treatment of him. The household was no longer a place for mockery. It was a place where consequences were real, and Odysseus had reminded them of that, even in his disguise. Penelope, ever cautious and wary of false hope, had observed the beggar for some time now. There was something about him, something in his eyes, that made her heart stir with a faint, distant hope. Yet doubt clouded her thoughts, and the years of pain had made her reluctant to embrace anything resembling the man she had once known. She had heard many stories over the years of men claiming to be Odysseus, but none had ever proven true. Her heart, worn thin with waiting, could not bear another false dawn. The beggar sat near her, his face weathered and ragged, but his eyes, those eyes were familiar in a way she could not fully grasp. Perhaps it was just the weariness of longing that made her seek him out, but there was something in his presence that made her hope. Still, hope was a fragile thing, and she knew she must test him, for her son's sake, for the sake of her own peace. Telemachus stood by her side, quietly watching, sensing the tension in the air. Penelope's voice broke the silence, soft but filled with a quiet resolve. "Stranger," she began, "you claim to have known my husband. Tell me, what was he like? What was his appearance, his manner?" The beggar looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Penelope's words were deliberate, a subtle challenge wrapped in the guise of curiosity. She wanted him to speak of things only Odysseus would know. She wanted a sign, some fragment of the man she had lost, to return to her, even if only for a moment. Odysseus, though masked in the rags of a beggar, knew this was the moment of reckoning. He had prepared for this, and his heart swelled with a mixture of love and longing as he gathered his strength to answer her. He knew he could not just speak of his face, of his travels. He had to give her something only they shared, something irrefutable. "Your husband," he began, his voice steady and filled with quiet sorrow, "was a man of great stature and strength. His eyes, like yours, held a sharpness, a fire that could not be dimmed, no matter the trials he faced." He paused, watching her closely, knowing that this part of the tale would reach her heart. "But there is one thing only you would know, Penelope. You remember, don't you, how we made the bed in our chamber? You know that it could not be moved. Only you and I ever saw it, because I built it around the trunk of an olive tree. It is a secret only we share." Penelope's breath caught in her throat, and her hands trembled slightly, though she fought to keep her composure. She had not spoken of the bed in years, but the memory was as vivid as the day Odysseus had crafted it. It was the symbol of their love, the one place in their home that was untouched by the passage of time, by the suitors, by the pain. It was theirs alone. She looked into the beggar's eyes, and in that moment, she knew with all the certainty of a heart that had never truly let go. Her Odysseus had returned. And in the quiet of the room, with the weight of their years between them, Penelope allowed herself to finally believe. The beggar before her was no longer just a stranger. He was her husband, returned home after all the trials and pain. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not weep. Instead, she smiled, a gentle, relieved smile, as she took his hand, knowing that the long wait was finally over. Odysseus and Telemachus stood together in the quiet of the palace, the weight of the coming battle pressing heavily upon them. The suitors, ignorant of the impending reckoning, continued their careless revelry, mocking the house that had once been a proud symbol of Ithaca's glory. Odysseus, though at last reunited with his son, was not yet free. His home was still overrun, his wife and wealth in the hands of men who had no right to them. The plan had been formed in the shadows, whispered between father and son as they stood side by side, the bond between them stronger than the years of separation. Together, they would strike when the moment was ripe, and only with the help of those few loyal servants who had kept their faith. Odysseus had long known that he could not face the suitors alone. His once mighty form had been battered by time and trial, but it was not just the strength of his arm that mattered now. His mind, sharp as ever, would guide him. The challenge was to take the suitors by surprise, to make them believe that all was still as it had been, that the power they held was absolute. But with Telemachus at his side, and with the quiet support of Eumaeus and Philoetius, his loyal swineherd and cowherd, they could still turn the tide. They spoke in low tones, going over every detail. The suitors had grown used to their lavish feasts, their drunken boasting, their cruel disregard for the laws of hospitality, but that was their undoing. Odysseus, ever the strategist, knew that they would be unprepared for what was to come. He and Telemachus would remain hidden in plain sight, as beggars, until the moment came when they could take up their arms. "We need to keep them distracted," Odysseus said quietly, his eyes scanning the room. "While we keep them occupied, you and I must make our way to the armory. We'll take the weapons they think they have all to themselves." Telemachus nodded, his youthful determination lighting his face. He had grown into a young man with strength and purpose, his training under Nestor and Menelaus having given him the skills he needed. But it was not just physical strength that would win the day. It was the power of their shared purpose, their loyalty to one another, and their hunger for justice. Meanwhile, Eumaeus and Philoetius would be stationed near the entrance, awaiting the signal to lock the doors. They, too, had been touched by Odysseus's return, loyal to the core, and ready to fight alongside their master in his hour of need. They would not be alone in this battle. The gods themselves had lent their favor. The sun was setting outside, and the last light of day fell through the windows, casting long shadows in the hall. The time to act was drawing near. Odysseus could feel his pulse quicken, his mind racing with all that he had planned. His eyes met Telemachus's once more, and in that silent exchange, both knew the final confrontation was at hand. No more waiting, no more fear. The plan was set. And with it, Odysseus's heart swelled with resolve. It was time to reclaim his home, time to take back what was rightfully his. Penelope, knowing the danger that loomed in the hearts of the suitors, devised a contest to test not only their strength, but their worthiness to rule the house that had once belonged to Odysseus. She took up the bow of her husband, long untouched and weathered by the years of absence, and placed it before the suitors. The contest was simple, but its implications vast. The suitors were to string the great bow of Odysseus, that weapon of legend, and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads lined up in a row. The challenge was not one easily met. The bow had been Odysseus's gift to himself, a symbol of his unmatched skill and strength, and no man in the hall could even come close to achieving the feat. One by one, the suitors stepped forward, eager to claim Penelope's hand, each trying and failing to string the bow, their efforts futile and clumsy. The bow seemed almost alive, resisting every man's attempt to draw it. Laughter and scoffing filled the hall as one suitor after another gave up, failing to string the bow and shoot the arrow. They were not even close. Odysseus, still in the guise of the beggar, watched the scene unfold with quiet amusement. His heart beat steadily as he waited for the right moment. The time was drawing near. He could feel the weight of the bow calling to him. He could hear its whisper, urging him to take it in hand once more. The suitors, their arrogance and entitlement swelling with every failure, began to ridicule each other, their hope fading. It was clear that none of them could even come close to succeeding. Telemachus, standing by his father's side, knew the moment had come. He stood tall, filled with pride and anticipation, his father's plan beginning to take shape. With a single glance from Odysseus, Telemachus understood. He made his way to the suitors and calmly spoke to them, declaring that the contest was now open to all, even the beggar. There was no sign of hesitation from the suitors. Their laughter was louder now, amused by the idea that a beggar would attempt what none of them could do. Odysseus stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a quiet resolve. The bow felt familiar in his hands as he grasped it. The suitors fell silent, their arrogance replaced by uneasy uncertainty. With steady hands, Odysseus drew the string and nocked the arrow. The bow seemed to hum, as if recognizing its master. With one fluid motion, Odysseus released the arrow, sending it flying straight through the 12 axe heads, piercing them with deadly precision. The suitors were left speechless, their laughter swallowed by the overwhelming truth of what they had just witnessed. Odysseus, in a single shot, had done what none of them could. His strength, his skill, and his claim to his home were undeniable. The contest was over, and in that moment, Penelope knew. The true king of Ithaca had returned. The moment the arrow pierced the 12 axe heads, silence fell over the hall. The suitors, who had been mocking the beggar moments before, now stood frozen, staring in disbelief. Odysseus, with the bow still in hand, revealed his true identity. His voice rang clear, declaring to them that he was Odysseus, son of Laertes, returned at last to reclaim his kingdom. The once laughing suitors now felt the cold grip of fear tighten around them. The beggar was their king, the very man they had wronged. The halls that had been filled with their arrogance and loud boasting were now filled with their terror. Telemachus, standing at his father's side, immediately sprang into action. His resolve was firm, his father's plan unfolding exactly as it had been meant to. Together, they stood as a united force, father and son, ready to end the reign of the suitors who had overrun their home. Loyal servants, like Eumaeus and Philoetius, who had long remained true to Odysseus, rushed to join them. Armed with swords, spears, and their own fury, they were ready to fight alongside their king, their master, their hope restored. The suitors, now aware of the impending doom, scrambled for their weapons. But it was too late. Odysseus, with the speed and skill of a seasoned warrior, struck the first blow, killing the leader of the suitors, Antinous, with a single arrow to the throat. The rest of the suitors rushed to defend themselves, but they were outmatched. Telemachus, with a sword in his hand, cut down another suitor as he tried to flee. Eumaeus and Philoetius joined the fray, slaying those who dared to rise against them. Chaos filled the hall as the suitors were cut down one by one. There was no mercy, no escape. The fate they had long deserved had arrived in the form of the man they had scorned. Blood stained the floor of the great hall as the sound of clashing weapons and dying cries echoed through the palace. It was the final reckoning for those who had dishonored the house of Odysseus. At last, there was only one suitor left, standing Amphinomus, who tried to beg for his life, but was struck down by Telemachus before he could speak another word. With that, the hall fell eerily quiet, the last of the suitors dead at their feet. Odysseus stood, his chest heaving with the exertion of battle, but his heart at peace. The bloodshed was over, and the palace was his once more. With the suitors gone, Odysseus and his son surveyed the wreckage of the hall. Their home had been reclaimed, and the gods had delivered justice. Yet there was still more to be done. Odysseus, knowing that some would doubt the righteousness of his actions, prepared for one final confrontation. But for now, his mind was clear. The suitors had paid for their wrongs. Penelope stood in the doorway, her heart still heavy with doubt, despite the slaughter of the suitors and the restoration of order in her home. She knew, as all wives do, the subtlety of her husband's manner, the way his gaze could shift when weighed with years of suffering and longing. This man standing before her, claiming to be Odysseus, could be no other yet. She could not let go of the smallest flicker of suspicion. For all the pain of waiting, of hoping, she had lived through too many false hopes to surrender her heart completely. As she gazed at him, she thought of their bed, that sacred, intimate place where they had first sworn their vows. She had spent 20 years maintaining the memory of its construction, the way he had built it with his own hands, carving into the very trunk of an olive tree. The bed was a symbol of their love, an anchor to her faith that he would return. If this man was truly Odysseus, there was one final way to prove it. The bed. "Stranger," she said quietly, her voice steady but laced with the weight of years. "Before I accept you fully, I must ask you to move our marriage bed. If you are truly Odysseus, then this task should be nothing for you built the bed yourself." She watched as the words sank into his mind, studying the slight tremor in his expression. Odysseus, feeling the intensity of the moment, immediately understood the test. He turned toward the bed, but instead of the feigned effort she might have expected from any other man, he paused. His face shifted from one of uncertainty to a sharp realization that this was his last chance to convince her. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the sacred post of the bed, and then, with quiet reverence, he spoke. "My dear wife, no man can move this bed. It is rooted in the very trunk of an olive tree, one that I planted with my own hands. No stranger could move it, for it is a symbol of our life together. Only we know the truth of this bed and what it represents." Odysseus's voice softened as he stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. Penelope felt the trembling of her own heart. The confusion and fear she had held onto for so long melt away. She understood in that moment the man before her was her husband. The test had not been for him, but for her, to release the fear that had gripped her for so long. Tears filled her eyes, and she threw herself into his arms. "It's truly you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My heart knew it, but my soul needed to see you in this way." With that, they embraced, and for the first time in years, Penelope felt the peace of knowing that Odysseus, her beloved, had returned to her. The trials, the pain, the separation it had all led to this moment, and finally they were whole again. Odysseus, his long journey finally at its end, walked with Telemachus toward the small farm where his father Laertes lived in seclusion. far from the palace where so much had transpired. After the slaughter of the suitors, there had been no time to rest, no time to truly savor his return. The land that had once been his kingdom was in turmoil, and his father, aged and frail, had remained out of sight, avoiding the chaos that had overtaken their home. When they arrived at the farm, Laertes was hard at work in his garden, his hands weathered by time and toil, the marks of years spent living without his son. As Odysseus stepped into the yard, a mix of emotions surged within him: joy, sorrow, and a profound relief that after all these years, he could finally embrace his father again. Laertes looked up slowly, his eyes squinting in disbelief as the man before him approached. He saw the familiar features, the strong, broad shoulders, the deep-set eyes, and yet, after so many years, he could not recognize him right away. It was not until Odysseus spoke, his voice thick with emotion, that Laertes knew the truth. "I am your son, Laertes," he said. His voice cracked with the weight of all the time and suffering that had passed. "Odysseus, your son, has returned." The recognition in his father's face came slowly, as though the reality of it was too much to bear. Laertes staggered, his hands trembling, before finally collapsing into his son's arms. The tears flowed freely between them, a reunion that was long overdue, a reunion that would never have happened had Odysseus not fought so hard against gods, monsters, and the very will of the earth itself. The bond between father and son, forged in hardship and sacrifice, was stronger than ever. They sat together in the quiet of the afternoon, sharing stories, reminiscing about old times when their lives had been different before the war, before the pain, before the endless years of longing. In that moment, Odysseus felt the weight of his trials lift just a little. For a fleeting moment, he was just a son sitting beside his father, and the world seemed right again, but their joy was short-lived. Word soon came that the families of the suitors Odysseus had killed were gathering. The bloodshed had not gone unnoticed, and revenge was in the air. The families, angry and grief-stricken, had not yet accepted their losses and vowed to make Odysseus pay. Tension rippled through the farm, and Odysseus knew that his trials were far from over. The quiet peace he had longed for was still out of reach. With his father by his side, however, he would not back down. The battle for his home was not yet over. The tension in Ithaca had not abated since the bloodshed in the palace. Word spread like wildfire that the families of the slain suitors had gathered in force, their grief now a bitter, vengeful fire that would not be quenched until Odysseus paid for the deaths of their sons. The mourners, men driven by rage and a thirst for revenge, plotted together in secret, gathering their weapons and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. They could not let the insults stand. They would make Odysseus suffer for the lives of their fallen. Led by Antinous' father, Eupeithes, they set out, a united front of vengeance, determined to confront the man who had brought them such ruin. The cry for justice echoed through the town, and soon men armed with swords and shields marched toward Odysseus' house, their eyes alight with fury. They were determined to kill the king who had slaughtered their sons, their families, their honor. Odysseus, still fresh from the battle with the suitors, stood firm as he prepared for the fight that was sure to come. His body was weary, his heart worn thin from the trials of the past, but he knew that he had to defend what was rightfully his. He gathered Telemachus, Eumaeus, and a few loyal servants to his side. Together, they would face the oncoming storm, prepared to fight with everything they had left. But just as the families drew near, ready to descend upon the palace in blood and fury, the gods intervened. Athena, ever the protector of Odysseus, appeared in the midst of the growing conflict, her presence a calming force, like a sudden gust of wind that stilled a raging sea. Her voice rang out, firm and commanding, silencing the gathered men. The gods were not blind to the suffering of Odysseus, and they had seen the rightness of his struggle. The suitors had brought dishonor to his home, and their families sought revenge without considering the greater justice of it all. Athena, in all her wisdom, saw the potential for further chaos and bloodshed, knowing that the cycle of vengeance would never cease unless it was stopped now. The gods willed peace, a divine intervention that no mortal could defy. Athena raised her spear high, and with a single wave of her hand, a protective aura spread around Odysseus, shielding him and his men from the anger of the suitors' families. She spoke, her voice firm as a decree, ensuring that the family's wrath would be contained. "You will not harm Odysseus," she commanded. "This man has suffered long enough. His home is his. Your grief is just, but your pursuit of vengeance will only tear Ithaca further apart." With her words, the anger of the families waned. Eupides, who had led the charge, stood silent before the goddess, realizing that they were powerless against the will of the gods. They dropped their weapons, the will to fight, draining from them as quickly as it had risen. For a moment, there was stillness, a silence, where the fury had once burned. The families, broken by the intervention of the gods, reluctantly accepted the will of the divine. As they turned to leave, a new understanding hung heavy in the air. The justice that Odysseus had fought for was not his alone to claim. The gods had decided. It was over. In the quiet aftermath, Odysseus stood tall, but the weight of his journey had not lessened. Though vengeance was no longer his to face, the cost of it all had been high, and he knew that peace in Ithaca was still fragile. The gods had intervened, but the land was still scarred. The air in Ithaca was thick with tension as the families of the slain suitors gathered, their hearts full of vengeful fire. They had come, with fury in their eyes and weapons in hand, seeking justice for the deaths of their sons. The cries of their grief filled the air, and their resolve was clear: Odysseus would pay for the lives of their children. It seemed as though no one could stop the impending bloodshed. No mortal force could quell their anger. But high above, where the gods watched over the affairs of men, a divine presence stirred. Athena, ever watchful of her beloved Odysseus, saw the inevitable conflict and felt the impending clash of wills. She knew that the bloodshed would not bring peace. It would only serve to prolong the suffering that Odysseus had already endured. The king had fought hard to reclaim his home, his family, and his honor. She had stood by him through every trial, every hardship, and now she saw her chance to intervene, to bring the cycle of vengeance to an end. With a single, swift motion, Athena descended to Ithaca, her radiant form shining with the brilliance of divine power. She was a towering figure, majestic and stern, her presence undeniable. The mortals below paused, their weapons heavy in their hands, as they turned their eyes toward the goddess. Athena's voice rang out like thunder across the gathering. "Enough," she commanded, her words echoing in the hearts of the assembled men. The fury in their eyes faltered as they looked to the goddess, their anger no match for her power. She stood between them and Odysseus, her divine protection wrapping around the king like an invisible shield. "This conflict will cease. No more blood will be shed today. This man has endured enough." The families, once filled with vengeful determination, now hesitated, their rage faltering in the face of divine authority. Eupides, their leader, stood at the front, his hand still gripping his weapon, but his heart wavering. He had come seeking vengeance, but now, faced with Athena's divine presence, the weight of his grief was tempered by fear. The goddess's command was absolute. Athena raised her spear high, her eyes fierce with resolve. "The gods have spoken," she declared. "The death of your sons is a tragedy, but no further bloodshed will bring them back. It is time to end this. Odysseus will not be harmed. Return to your homes." A silence fell over the gathering, the families of the suitors looking at one another, uncertain as the goddess's power swept over them. The will for vengeance, once so firm and unyielding, began to melt away under Athena's gaze. They knew that to defy the gods would be to seal their own doom. One by one, the families lowered their weapons, their spirits broken by the divine intervention. They knew there was no way to challenge the goddess, no way to continue their pursuit of revenge. With a final, lingering look at Odysseus, Athena turned and vanished into the heavens, her work done. Peace had been restored, and the cycle of vengeance was finally broken. In the quiet aftermath, Odysseus, though weary, stood victorious, knowing that the gods had once again shielded him from destruction. The weight of the gods' judgment had fallen, and Ithaca would now know peace. In the wake of the conflict, as the dust settled and peace was restored, the people of Ithaca gathered to honor the return of their king. The tension that had once filled the air with the scent of impending battle was now replaced by a collective sigh of relief, a shared sense of hope for the future. A feast was prepared, not only to celebrate Odysseus's triumphant return, but to mark the healing of the wounds that had plagued the island for so long. The banquet hall was set with an abundance of food, a spread worthy of the gods. The finest meats, fruits, and wines from across Ithaca adorned the tables, and the air was filled with the sweet fragrance of roasted lamb and fresh bread. The people, both noble and common, sat together in unity, their once divided hearts now bound by the resolution of the conflict. There were no more suitors to crowd the halls, no more whispers of rebellion in the shadows. It was a time for togetherness, a time to rebuild the bonds that had been fractured during Odysseus's long absence. Penelope, radiant in her joy and relief, sat beside her husband, her gaze never leaving his. She had spent years doubting and waiting, torn between hope and sorrow. Now, as she looked upon the man who had returned to her, all those years of longing seemed to melt away. The love they shared was renewed, as strong as it had ever been. Her heart swelled with a quiet happiness, knowing that Ithaca was once again whole and her family was reunited. Odysseus, though weary from the trials he had endured, could not help but feel a sense of peace. He sat at the head of the table, the weight of kingship and the burdens of the past lifted from his shoulders. The laughter of his people filled the hall, a sound that seemed almost foreign after so many years of isolation. His heart swelled with pride as he watched his son, Telemachus, engage with the citizens of Ithaca, now a young man who had grown into his own strength and wisdom. As the evening wore on, stories were shared, songs were sung, and the halls of Odysseus' home echoed with joy. The island, once plagued by division and uncertainty, now stood united, its people celebrating not only the return of their king but the return of peace. The feast was not only a celebration of Odysseus's journey home, but of the resilience of Ithaca itself. In the quiet moments that followed, as the firelight flickered and the last of the wine was shared among friends, Odysseus leaned back in his seat, a smile tugging at his lips. He had fought for this, fought for his home, his family, and his people. And now, in this moment of quiet joy, he knew that the island was safe, that the gods had smiled upon him once more. The journey was over, and Ithaca would know peace for generations to come. Odysseus, now reunited with his family and his throne, took his rightful place as the ruler of Ithaca. The island, which had suffered under the chaos of his long absence, began to feel the steady hand of a king who had endured hardship and emerged wiser for it. With the suitors' bloodshed behind him, the people of Ithaca looked to their king for the stability they had so desperately needed. The first days of his rule were marked by a calm resolve. Odysseus wasted no time in addressing the pressing concerns of his kingdom. He called upon his council, gathering the elders and trusted advisors to discuss the state of the island. The people had lived through years of uncertainty, and it was now his task to restore the sense of peace and order that had once defined Ithaca. Under his guidance, the laws were reaffirmed, and justice was restored. The lands that had been ravaged by the suitors' insolence were tended to, and the people, once divided by factions and feuds, were brought together under a common purpose. Odysseus ensured that every man, woman, and child had a place within the renewed kingdom. No longer would the island be ruled by lawlessness or fear of the powerful. The king's word would be final, tempered by wisdom and fairness. One of Odysseus's first actions was to strengthen the bonds between the island's various regions. He personally visited the neighboring towns and villages, speaking with the people, listening to their concerns, and ensuring that the roads between the settlements were secure. His presence was a symbol of unity, and as he moved through the land, the people of Ithaca began to see a future in which they could thrive once more. Telemachus, now a young man of stature, stood beside his father in these endeavors, offering his own counsel and leadership. Together, they navigated the delicate balance between authority and compassion. Telemachus's maturation mirrored that of the island. The boy who had once been uncertain and searching was now a man, his purpose clear alongside his father. While peace took root, Odysseus never forgot the sacrifices his people had made. He ensured that the injured were cared for, the poor were provided for, and the wounded hearts of Ithaca were mended. His wisdom as a ruler, honed through years of struggle, was now applied to the kingdom he had fought so hard to protect. As time passed, the harvests grew richer, the fields fuller, and the homes warmer. Ithaca began to flourish once more, its prosperity, a testament to Odysseus's strength as both a warrior and a king. Under his rule, the kingdom was no longer haunted by the past. It was a kingdom reborn, where the people could look to the future with hope, guided by the steady hand of a king who had survived the greatest trials and returned to restore his home. The gods gathered once more on Mount Olympus, their divine presence casting a shadow over the world below. Their discussions turned toward Ithaca and the fate of Odysseus, whose long journey had finally come to an end. The mortal king, having fought against overwhelming odds and endured endless trials, now sat upon his throne, his people restored and his family reunited. Yet, as the gods well knew, the balance of power among mortals was fragile, and even a king as resilient as Odysseus required their watchful eyes. Athena, ever the champion of Odysseus, spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of years spent guiding him through peril. She had seen him through the treacherous seas, the terrifying monsters, and the dangers of the gods themselves. Now, standing in the halls of Ithaca as a king, Odysseus needed no further tests of strength. What he required now was the blessing of the gods, their favor, and their protection as he solidified his rule. Zeus, the king of the gods, nodded in agreement, his thunderous voice rumbling across the heavens. He, too, recognized the worth of Odysseus, not only as a warrior but as a man of wisdom and patience. His trials had not been in vain. The gods had long seen the spark of greatness in Odysseus, and now it was time for him to rule with the understanding that came from suffering. The gods had watched as he had reclaimed his home, and they now turned their attention to the future. They knew the mortal world was unpredictable, with potential for strife, jealousy, and rebellion at every corner. Yet, even in the face of such uncertainty, Odysseus had proven his ability to bring peace and stability to Ithaca. His kingdom, though fractured for so long, was now united, and his people thrived under his reign. With a final nod from Zeus, the gods agreed to bless Odysseus's rule, ensuring that he would not face another wave of misfortune. The island would be protected from the whims of other gods and mortals who might wish to disrupt the peace. Athena raised her spear in silent approval, promising to watch over him as she had since the beginning, offering guidance when needed, but allowing him the freedom to rule with the wisdom he had earned. Their decision made, the gods dispersed, leaving Ithaca in the hands of its rightful king. Odysseus, now fully aware of the divine forces that shaped his fate, could rest, knowing that the gods had secured his place on the throne. His kingdom would remain strong, his people would flourish, and the legacy of his return would be one of stability and peace, built on the foundation of both human strength and divine favor. Telemachus stood at the edge of the palace courtyard, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped below the sea, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. His heart swelled with pride and purpose. knowing that the time had come for him to step fully into the role that destiny had long set before him. Though his father, Odysseus, had returned and restored peace to Ithaca, it was now Telemachus's turn to take up the mantle of leadership. The weight of the island's future rested heavily on his shoulders, yet he no longer felt the uncertainty that had once defined his youth. His journey, though brief compared to his father's, had shaped him into a man capable of carrying the responsibilities of governance. As he walked through the halls of the palace, Telemachus found his father sitting in the great room, his face a mask of calm, yet his eyes filled with the wisdom of the years. The bond between father and son was now unspoken, forged through their shared experiences, the trials and triumphs of their family. Odysseus had reclaimed the throne, but he knew that Telemachus was ready to take the reins of the kingdom in due time. He had seen the growth in his son, the quiet strength that had emerged from the boy who had once looked to others for guidance. Now, Telemachus could command a room, address his people with confidence, and, most importantly, make decisions that would guide Ithaca into a new era. "Father," Telemachus said, his voice steady but full of anticipation, "the time has come. I feel it in my bones. Ithaca must move forward, not merely survive." Odysseus looked at him, pride in his gaze. "I have seen you grow, Telemachus. I know you are ready for this. It will not be an easy road, but you will not walk it alone. You have the strength and wisdom to lead, and you have earned the trust of the people." The words of his father settled within him, filling him with resolve. He had witnessed the hardships his father had faced, the way he had navigated the complexities of rule and diplomacy, and the delicate balance required to maintain peace. But Telemachus understood that his own path would be different. His father's legend loomed large, and while it would be impossible to step fully into those shoes, he would carve his own legacy, one built on fairness, justice, and the lessons learned from the struggles of the past. Telemachus spent the coming days meeting with the island's leaders, listening to the concerns of his people, and familiarizing himself with the intricacies of governance. The challenges were not small, and there were many who would test his resolve. Yet he knew that with patience, guidance from his father, and the strength he had found within himself, he would not falter. As he stood on the threshold of this new chapter, Telemachus could finally see his future, clearly a future where he would lead Ithaca with wisdom, courage, and the unshakable desire to ensure that his people flourished under his reign. Odysseus sat by the hearth, the firelight casting long shadows on the stone walls of his home. The years of wandering, the endless trials, and the hard-earned victories seemed to weigh on him now, more than they had in his younger days. His hands, once strong and steady in battle, now trembled ever so slightly as he held a cup of wine, his fingers tracing the rim, lost in thought. Ithaca had been reclaimed, the suitors vanquished, and the peace restored. But still, Odysseus could not rid himself of the quiet, ever-present ache within his chest, reminder of all he had lost and all he had gained along the way. The journey had shaped him into a man, unlike the one who had first set sail from these shores, eager to fight for glory and a place in history. He had once sought nothing more than to return home, to reclaim his throne, and to restore his kingdom. But with each passing trial, each new godly interference, and each encounter with monsters and men alike, Odysseus had learned. Not just about survival, but about himself, about the nature of leadership and the cost of pride. The gods had tested him relentlessly. Athena had guided him, Poseidon had tormented him, and even the fates had played their cruel hand in the cards he'd been dealt. He had stood at the edge of death more times than he cared to remember, yet somehow he had always survived. He had learned that strength wasn't just in the arm or in the sword, but in the mind and in the heart. He had learned patience, restraint, and humility. Yet there was no escape from the man. He had been the one who had once turned his back on his men for the sake of a personal victory or a moment's glory. That man still lingered within him, despite all the wisdom he had accumulated. Looking out over the quiet fields of Ithaca, Odysseus thought of the lives he had shaped, the men he had led, and those he had failed. The faces of his fallen comrades often haunted his dreams, their silent accusations more deafening than the thunderous waves that had battered his ship. His heart ached for them, and for the family he had lost in his absence, his wife, Penelope, whose steadfast loyalty had been both a beacon and a burden. His son, Telemachus, who had grown up without a father, had become a man in his own right. They had both endured, but the toll had been great. And now, here in the peace he had fought so hard for, Odysseus found solace in the quiet moments. He had reclaimed his throne, but what was left for him now? What did a man who had seen it all, done it all, seek in the twilight of his years? The answer was not as clear as it had once seemed. There was no more glory to be won, no more trials to face, only the stillness of a kingdom and the uncertain future of the legacy he would leave behind. He had survived, yes, but in surviving, he had changed. And perhaps, in that change, lay his greatest victory. As Odysseus stood in the quiet of his palace, the evening wind carrying the scent of the sea, he could not shake the feeling that his journey was far from over. His kingdom was secure, his family restored, but the weight of ancient words still pressed upon his soul. Prophecies, whispered by seers long past, had followed him throughout his trials, shaping the course of his life and the fate of Ithaca. He had heard them, he had faced them, and yet their echoes lingered, as though the gods still held the final hand to play. It had been years since the last great test, since he had returned home to reclaim his kingdom and purge the suitors who had besieged it. The gods had spoken of vengeance and triumph, of a king's return, and the restless blood of the heroes who had fallen by his side. Yet, even as he celebrated, there were moments when Odysseus would wake in the stillness of the night, and the shadows of those ancient prophecies would stir once more. A word from Tiresias, the blind prophet in the underworld, surfaced again in his mind. You will live to see your home restored, Odysseus, but there will be no peace without more trials. For a time, you will be the ruler of men, but there is always a price for that crown. Tiresias had warned him of the inevitable, the unrelenting future that would test him once more, though Odysseus had hoped that the gods had finally released him from their unyielding grip. The words haunted him, for they spoke of challenges yet to come, even as the fires of war had seemingly been quenched. The seers, like the one who had foretold the suitors' destruction, spoke in riddles. They said Ithaca would know peace, but not without a cost. And so Odysseus wondered what lay ahead. Would the restless spirits of those he had slain, both mortal and divine, continue to demand their tribute? Or was the peace he now enjoyed only the calm before a storm yet to gather? Athena had stood by him through it all, and even now, the goddess watched over him, unseen. The thought of her watching, listening to the ebb and flow of his thoughts, reassured him. In the end, peace would come through the sword or the spear, but through patience, understanding, and the lessons learned over years of suffering and survival. He could not know exactly what the future would hold, but the gods had promised him one thing: Ithaca would endure. It might face storms yet, and perhaps he would not always sit in the halls of power, but his people would carry on. His legacy, in whatever form it would take, would be the bond that held Ithaca together. For now, though, Odysseus knew that the island had finally found peace. Whether it would last a lifetime or be only a moment's respite, he could not say. But in his heart, there was a quiet certainty. The gods would continue to weave their plans, but for this brief moment, the tapestry was his own. The gods sat together, their golden thrones gleaming in the vast hall of Olympus, their voices quiet as they pondered the journey of Odysseus. From his humble beginnings to his glorious return, they had watched him struggle, suffer, and ultimately triumph. They had molded his path, guided him through trials, and tested him in ways few mortals could endure. But now, As the dust of his trials settled and peace reigned on Ithaca, the gods could not help but reflect on what had passed and what lay ahead. Zeus, the king of gods, looked down at the mortal world, his eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. "Odysseus has taught us much," he murmured. In his perseverance, he revealed the nature of true leadership, the resilience of the human spirit. He has faced divine wrath, the cruelty of fate, and the depths of his own flaws. Yet, he has returned to his home, his people, and his throne. But does he know the price of his journey? Athena, ever the advocate for Odysseus, spoke with a tone of both admiration and caution. He has learned the weight of his decisions. Each trial was a lesson, and though the gods guided him, it was his own wit and heart that carried him through. His wisdom has grown immeasurably, as has his understanding of the fragility of life. It is true that the gods tested him, but Odysseus also tested the gods. He never let our will define his fate. Poseidon, whose fury had driven much of Odysseus's suffering, shifted in his seat, his gaze clouded with ancient resentment. Do not forget the cost of this hero's pride. For every god, for every mortal who fell in his wake, Odysseus must bear some measure of guilt. He has outsmarted me, yes, but it was at the expense of those who suffered for his actions. It is not enough to simply return home. Yet, even as Poseidon's words lingered, Apollo, the god of prophecy and light, spoke up, his voice clear and serene. The path of heroes is never simple. They shape their fates, but in doing so, they also shape ours. Odysseus has made the world richer, though his steps have not been without pain. It is through his mistakes and triumphs that we all learn the nature of sacrifice. The gods fell into silence, contemplating the enormity of what had passed. Mortals, after all, were their playthings, their puppets to pull and guide. But Odysseus had become more than that. He had become a force of nature, both for good and ill. In his victories, they saw themselves reflected, a reminder of their own trials, their own limitations. And as they looked toward the mortal world, the gods understood that while Odysseus had earned his peace, the world was never static. Ithaca would endure, and so too would the lessons of the hero's journey. They would linger in the hearts of mortals for generations to come, passed down as tales of gods and men, of wisdom and folly. Odysseus had returned home, but in many ways, his journey was far from over. It was now time for the gods to watch, in quiet approval, as his legacy unfolded across the ages. Telemachus stood before the assembled people of Ithaca, the weight of the crown heavy upon his brow. His journey had prepared him for this momentous trials, his conversations with wise men, the lessons learned from the tales of distant lands. But even now, as he gazed out at his people, he felt the tremor of uncertainty, the quiet echo of his father's absence. Yet, his heart burned with determination. The time had come for him to take up the mantle of leadership. His father, Odysseus, had returned after 20 years of wandering. The suitors had been dealt with, the throne restored to its rightful place, but Ithaca's future was still uncertain. It was no longer enough for Odysseus to reign. It was Telemachus who now had to prove himself worthy of the legacy that had been left for him. The gods had smiled upon his father's return, but they were not omnipotent. It was Telemachus, and Telemachus alone, who would need to guide his people with wisdom and strength. Odysseus, now older, stood by his son's side, a quiet presence but one brimming with pride. He had spent his youth building a kingdom, carving his name into the very fabric of the earth, and now, with his return, he saw his son rise to take the reins of that kingdom. Telemachus had proven himself capable, not just in battle but in diplomacy, in understanding what his people needed. The boy who had once looked for his father was now the man who would govern in his stead. The ceremony was simple, but it held an air of great significance. The people, who had suffered under the long absence of their king, looked to Telemachus with hope. His youthful face, hardened by the trials he had faced, was now set with the resolve of a ruler. As the priests performed their rites, blessing him in the eyes of the gods. Telemachus felt a surge of confidence. The gods had guided his father. Now they would guide him as well. The land of Ithaca, once torn by division, was now united under the rule of Odysseus's son. His first task as king was to ensure that peace would reign. The rivalries between the noble families, fueled by the absence of Odysseus, had left their scars on the island. But with Telemachus now in power, the people looked forward to stability, to the wisdom of a leader who had spent his youth watching his father and learning from him. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but it was his to walk. Telemachus turned to the crowd, his voice steady as he spoke. He vowed to honor his father's legacy, to restore Ithaca to the prosperity it had once known, and to rule justly and with wisdom. The people, hearing the sincerity in his words, erupted in applause. The young king had taken his place, and with that, Ithaca had entered a new era, one defined not by the long shadow of his father's absence, but by Telemachus's own promise. Odysseus stood at the edge of Ithaca, gazing out across the calm waters that had been both his torment and his refuge. His journey had spanned decades, filled with unimaginable trials, triumphs, and sacrifices. But now, after all the wars, the wandering, the bloodshed, and the reconciliation, the end was near. The gods had granted him peace, but it was a peace that he knew could not last forever. He had returned to his homeland, restored order, and seen his son take the throne. But there was still one final path for him to walk. The people of Ithaca had celebrated his return, his strength, and his wisdom. They praised him for his cunning, his bravery, and his leadership. They saw him not only as a king, but as a symbol of endurance, a man who had faced death, gods, and monsters, only to return to the place that had always been his heart's true home. But Odysseus, in the quiet moments, knew there was more to life than the accolades and the titles. He had lived for his people, for his family, and for his kingdom. But now, he had lived long enough. He made his way to the shores, where the winds were calm and the world seemed still. The horizon called to him, not as a place of unknowns and dangers, but as a final destination. It was not a journey to prove his worth, nor a battle to fight. It was simply a journey to see the life he had built from a distance, to understand the legacy he would leave behind, and to know that his work was done. His thoughts turned to Telemachus, his son, who now stood ready to rule Ithaca with strength and wisdom. He had watched the boy grow into a man, taking his place at the throne with honor. It was no longer necessary for Odysseus to carry the weight of kingship. He had passed on what he could, imparting wisdom through years of experience and struggle. His son would be the future of Ithaca, and the island would prosper under his reign. Odysseus felt the winds pick up, a reminder of the long voyages he had once endured. But now, he was no longer a warrior of the seas, no longer the man who needed to prove himself. He was simply Odysseus, a man at peace, content in the knowledge that he had done what was required of him. The trials of life were behind him, and ahead was a quieter path, one he had earned with every decision and sacrifice. The people of Ithaca would remember him, not for the battles he fought, but for the peace he had brought to the land. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Odysseus took his final step into the unknown, at peace with the life he had lived, and with the legacy he had left behind. The tale of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, echoed through the ages, carried by the winds of time and the voices of poets. His name became synonymous with wisdom, cunning, and perseverance, inspiring heroes and storytellers alike. The people of Ithaca, though they had seen the end of his life, could not forget the legacy he left behind. His trials, his triumphs, and his journey from the shores of Troy to the comforts of home were woven into the fabric of their culture. Odysseus was no longer just a king. He had become a legend. His name was spoken with reverence in the halls of courts and on the lips of sailors who sailed the vast seas he had once navigated. His story was told in taverns, in great halls, and on the steps of temples, where his wisdom was honored as much as his strength. Poets sang of his cunning in the face of monsters, of his resilience against the wrath of gods, and of his unyielding love for his family and kingdom. His journey was more than a series of battles. It was a journey of the heart and soul, a reflection of human struggle and hope. As the years passed, generations of Ithacans learned the lessons of Odysseus's life. They were taught not just to fight, but to think, not just to survive, but to endure. They spoke of how he had faced every challenge with the knowledge that he was never alone, that his family, his kingdom, and the gods themselves were the forces that drove him forward. He had sacrificed everything for the sake of love, loyalty, and home, and in doing so, had become the epitome of heroism. Beyond Ithaca, his story traveled with the winds, reaching distant lands where kings and warriors found themselves inspired by his example. It was in the shadows of Odysseus that many of the greatest heroes of the future would stand. They spoke of his adventures as if they had been there with him, part of the great tapestry of history that he had woven with his own blood, sweat, and tears. They learned the art of leadership, of strategy, and of perseverance from his journey. His tale was not just a story, it was a blueprint for survival in a world that demanded strength and wisdom in equal measure. But the true legacy of Odysseus lay not in the battles he fought or the kingdoms he built, but in the ideals he upheld. He had shown the world that it was not brute force alone that defined a hero, but the will to return home, to face one's trials with integrity, and to fight for the ones you loved. And in this way, Odysseus, the king, the wanderer, and the father, would never truly be forgotten. His name would live on in every hero who dared to embark on a journey of their own. The years passed, but the memory of Odysseus never faded. His legacy, woven into the fabric of Ithaca, transcended time and was immortalized in the songs of bards and the whispers of old men who gathered by the fire. His story, filled with trials, triumphs, and unwavering devotion to his home, became a beacon for those who sought to understand the true meaning of heroism. His name, spoken with reverence, echoed through the halls of Ithaca, passed down from one generation to the next, a constant reminder of what it meant to endure. The people of Ithaca held Odysseus in the highest regard, honoring him not just as a king, but as a symbol of their resilience and strength. In every corner of the island, there were songs sung of his return songs that painted vivid pictures of his long journey, his battles with gods and monsters, and his ultimate return to his beloved family. These stories shaped the hearts and minds of the youth, teaching them the values of loyalty, courage, and wisdom. Odysseus was more than a ruler. He was a father, a warrior, and a man who had faced the very wrath of the gods and emerged victorious. The great hall in Ithaca, once filled with the sounds of feasting and revelry, now stood as a sacred place of remembrance. It was where Odysseus had returned to reclaim his throne, and where his people gathered to honor the legacy he had built. His name was etched into the stones of the island, not just in the physical monuments erected in his honor, but in the hearts of those who lived by his example. Every year, as the seasons turned and the harvests were gathered, the people of Ithaca came together to celebrate the hero who had given everything for his family and kingdom. They offered sacrifices to the gods, not in a bid for favor, but as a gesture of gratitude for the wisdom and strength they had inherited through Odysseus. His teachings had become the foundation upon which Ithaca stood, and the values he had instilled in his people continued to guide them in times of peace and in times of turmoil. And as the island flourished under the rule of Telemachus, the son Odysseus had left behind, there was a quiet understanding that the hero's spirit lived on in every decision made, in every challenge faced, and in the quiet moments of reflection by the sea. The story of Odysseus was not just a tale of adventure, it was the story of the human spirit, a spirit that could overcome the greatest of odds and always find its way home. His legacy would never die, for it was carved into the very soul of Ithaca, a beacon of hope and strength for all who would come after. The sun sank low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills of Ithaca. Odysseus, now an older man, stood on the terrace of his palace, gazing out at the island he had fought so long to return to. The weight of his journey, the endless trials, and the countless battles, both with gods and mortals, seemed to fade into the background as the sea before him stretched out, peaceful and calm. For the first time in many years, he felt a sense of tranquility settle over him. His journey, filled with pain, loss, and heartache, had finally brought him here, to this moment of quiet reflection. He thought of the years spent adrift, of the islands that had been both his prison and his salvation, of the people he had met, and of the gods who had shaped his fate. His heart still carried the scars of those days, the pain of separation from his family, the toll of his battles, and the burden of leadership. But with time, Odysseus had come to understand that each of those trials had imparted wisdom, shaping him into the man who now stood as the king of Ithaca. The wisdom he had gained from his suffering was immeasurable, and it was that wisdom, not the triumphs of war, that would guide him through the remainder of his days. The journey he had made was not just physical, but one of the soul. His years of wandering had shown him the limits of human strength and the power of the gods, but they had also taught him patience, humility, and the deep love he held for his family and home. He had learned that heroism was not always about defeating foes or winning battles. Sometimes it was about surviving, enduring, and returning home, no matter how long or difficult the road. As Odysseus watched the waves crash gently on the shore, he could not help but feel a profound sense of peace. The future of Ithaca was secure in the hands of his son, Telemachus, a young man with the same strength, courage, and wisdom that had defined Odysseus himself. The island would flourish under Telemachus's rule, and Odysseus, now an elder, would find solace in knowing that the legacy of his journey of all the hardships he had faced would live on in the heart of his son. For all the struggles and sacrifices, Odysseus realized that his greatest achievement was not in defeating the monsters or gods that had sought to destroy him, but in finding his way back home to the people who had waited for him. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, he knew his journey was over, but his story would live on, not just in the songs of bards, but in the very fabric of the island he had saved. Telemachus stood in the center of the grand hall, the walls of Ithaca's palace echoing with the hum of conversation and the shuffle of servants. The day was bright, the sun piercing through the high windows, casting long shadows on the polished floors. He could feel the weight of the crown he had inherited, though it did not rest upon his head. His father's crown had been passed to him not in a grand ceremony, but through years of growth, both as a man and as a leader. The people of Ithaca, who had once looked to Odysseus as their guiding light, now saw in Telemachus the promise of a new dawn where justice and progress would reign. The time had come for Telemachus to forge his own path. No longer a boy chasing the echoes of his father's greatness, he had become a man whose wisdom had been honed through his own trials, both personal and political. He had witnessed the mistakes of those who ruled in anger and vengeance, and he had seen how easily a kingdom could be torn apart by ambition and greed. Ithaca would not fall into the same traps. His father's legacy was not one to be imitated, but to be built upon. Odysseus had shown him the value of cunning and strength, but Telemachus understood now that true leadership required more than wisdom. It required compassion, understanding, and above all, a commitment to fairness. In the coming weeks, Telemachus called together the island's elders and key advisors. He listened as they spoke of the old ways and the future of Ithaca, but his decisions would be his own. The lands of Ithaca were fertile, their resources vast, but for too long, its people had lived in fear of outsiders, dependent on war and defense. Telemachus knew that the island needed peace. A new era required new thinking. He encouraged his people to turn their energies towards trade and commerce, to forge alliances with neighboring lands that would bring prosperity, rather than relying solely on the strength of their warriors. He sought to strengthen their relationships with the gods, ensuring that the people honored the gods in ways that would bring blessings, rather than just in times of peril. Under Telemachus's rule, Ithaca became a place of both justice and opportunity. He worked tirelessly to root out corruption in his court, ensuring that those who held power did not abuse it for personal gain. In the courts, those who sought justice found a fair ear, and his people began to trust in their king's desire to make Ithaca a kingdom for all. He also made strides in reforming the island's defense, knowing that a peaceful reign was not one without strength. As the seasons changed and the island flourished, Telemachus looked back on his journey with a quiet satisfaction. He was no longer just the son of Odysseus, was Telemachus, king of Ithaca. And though the weight of his father's legacy would always be a part of him, Telemachus had begun to carve his own. Under his reign, Ithaca's future would be one of progress and prosperity, founded on justice, unity, and the wisdom of both the past and the present. Years passed in Ithaca, and though Odysseus had long since faded from the active memory of the people, his presence lingered like the fragrance of a flower long after it has bloomed. His wisdom, his victories, and his very essence had been woven into the very fabric of the island's identity. His legacy was not confined to the stone walls of his palace or the tales told by his son. It lived in the actions of his people, in the choices of those who carried his name into the future. Telemachus, now a mature and respected ruler, often found himself reflecting on the lessons he had inherited from his father. Odysseus had taught him more than strategy and the ways of war. It was his sense of purpose, his ability to adapt in the face of adversity, and his understanding of the delicate balance between wisdom and strength that truly shaped the way Telemachus governed Ithaca. His father's trials had served as a guide, not only for how to rule, but for how to live. It was through Odysseus's example that Telemachus learned that true leadership didn't come from a crown or a title. It came from the ability to listen, to change, and to endure. The people of Ithaca, too, began to internalize the lessons that Odysseus had left behind. His name was spoken not only with reverence, but with a kind of almost as if his very spirit was still present among them. He had taught them that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope. His journeys had been fraught with danger, but his triumphs, though hard-earned, had left the island stronger than before. The islanders passed his story from generation to generation, ensuring that the tales of his wit and strength would continue to shape the values of their society. Yet, it wasn't just the warriors or the leaders who kept Odysseus alive in their hearts. His legacy was found in the everyday lives of the people, the merchants who made careful deals, the farmers who sowed seeds with patience and thoughtfulness, the craftsmen who labored with pride. All of them were, in some small way, carrying the lessons of Odysseus forward. His ability to survive, to thrive despite overwhelming odds, had become a symbol of resilience. His adaptability had become a core value of the islanders, a reflection of their own perseverance. As the years turned, Telemachus continued to lead with the same vision his father had instilled in him. And though Odysseus was no longer there to guide him directly, the echoes of his teachings reverberated in every decision made, in every policy enacted. The island prospered, and Ithaca became a beacon not only for its physical strength, but for the wisdom of its people. The final legacy of Odysseus was not merely the lands he ruled, but the culture he had fostered on, of resilience, honor, and a deep understanding of the complexities of life. His legacy endured through the actions of those he left behind, carried forward with honor, ensuring that Ithaca remained, as it always had been, a place of hope and strength. As the years unfolded on Ithaca, Odysseus transformed in ways his younger self would have scarcely imagined. The battle-hardened warrior, once defined by his cunning and strength, had become a king whose wisdom shaped the very heart of his island. His once solitary pursuit of glory had shifted, and in its place stood a profound understanding of what it truly meant to lead not through sheer might, but through insight and foresight. The rugged exterior of a warrior remained, but beneath it lay a man who had come to realize that true power lay in the mind, not the sword. This transformation, however, had not been easy. The journey had cost him more than just time. It had cost him pieces of himself. The once immovable desire for adventure, the drive to conquer every challenge, had been tempered by the long years of struggle, loss, and finally, homecoming. What had once driven him, his unrelenting pursuit of personal triumph, now found its counterpart in a more complex, far-reaching vision. His mind, once obsessed with outwitting his enemies, now focused on outwitting the very forces of fate that had tested him so mercilessly. He had learned that wisdom did not come only from victories, but from the scars left by defeats as well. Odysseus's transformation was not just internal. His leadership, which once relied on his command in battle, had gradually evolved into a governance that centered on patience, justice, and empathy. Where his earlier decisions had been swift and often harsh, those that followed were carefully weighed and considered. He had learned that the well-being of his people depended not only on defense from external threats, but on creating a society where peace, stability, and growth could flourish. The lessons of the gods, his experiences with men and monsters alike, had all led him to one irrefutable truth, that a king's worth was measured by his people's prosperity, not the size of his conquests. And yet, this shift in his identity was not without conflict. There were moments when Odysseus longed for the adventure, the rush of battle, the sense of invincibility that had once defined him. But those moments were fleeting. His desires had evolved, and with them, his sense of self. No longer did he yearn for the glory of a hero. Instead, he sought the quiet, enduring strength of a ruler who would be remembered for how he shaped lives, not how many battles he won. The man who had once returned to Ithaca as a stranger now looked out upon the island as its true king. It was no longer the site of his trials, but the home of his legacy. The transformation was complete not just in Odysseus himself, but in how the people of Ithaca saw him. He had transcended his warrior's past to become a symbol of what it meant to evolve with age and experience, to embrace wisdom over glory, and to lead with a steady hand through the storms of life. The man who had once defined his identity by his conquests now saw that his true identity lay in his capacity to guide his people into a future where their prosperity and peace were guaranteed. The gods gathered once again on Olympus, their voices filled with a rare solemnity as they discussed the journey of Odysseus. They had watched him for years through his suffering, his triumphs, and his eventual return to Ithaca, and now they saw him as something more than just a mortal hero. They had witnessed his transformation, from the reckless warrior who sought glory above all else, to the wise king who had returned to lead his people. There was something undeniably remarkable about the way Odysseus had navigated the trials set before him, and even the gods could not deny the depth of his evolution. Athena, who had guided him through so many of his most difficult moments, spoke first. She had always been fond of Odysseus, seeing in him a reflection of her own intellect and cunning. But even she could not have anticipated the man he would become. "He has shown wisdom that no mortal should possess," she said, her voice resonating with pride. "Though he endured so much, he has never allowed the trials of his journey to break him. Instead, they have shaped him into something more. He is no longer just a hero, but a ruler whose decisions reflect the lessons of the gods themselves." Zeus, the king of the gods, nodded in agreement. It is true. Odysseus's journey was never just about his return to Ithaca. His path has always been a lesson for all mortals. He has faced the gods themselves and outwitted them. He has journeyed through places where others would have faltered, and yet he has emerged stronger with every trial. Now, he sits as king, not merely because he is the son of a great father, or because of his strength, but because he has earned the trust of his people. Hermes, ever the observer, added his voice. And let us not forget the humility that he now carries. Once driven by pride, Odysseus now understands that his true strength lies not in his own abilities, but in the hearts of those who follow him. He has built something enduring, not just in Ithaca, but in his soul. Apollo, watching quietly, spoke last, his voice calm and clear. Odysseus is one of the greats, yes, but it is his wisdom and his ability to change that sets him apart. He has grown beyond what we thought possible for a mortal. His name will be sung through the ages, not because he conquered lands or defeated monsters, but because he understood the true meaning of leadership and sacrifice. He is now a legend, not just for what he has done, but for what he has become. And so, the gods agreed that Odysseus had earned his place among the greatest of heroes. His journey had not been defined solely by his physical feats, but by the wisdom he had gained along the way. The gods, for all their power and omniscience, recognized the truth that Odysseus had already learned. The greatest victories were not those won on the battlefield, but those won within the soul. As the years passed and Odysseus's tale became the stuff of legend, the shores of Ithaca settled into a peace that had long been absent. The struggles and hardships of the past had been put to rest, and the island, once scarred by the reckless ambitions of suitors and the turbulence of war, began to thrive once more. Odysseus, now a king tempered by experience, knew that the future of his land would not rest on his shoulders alone. He had laid the foundation for a new beginning, one that was not dictated by the turbulent events of his past, but by the strength of the people he had fought so long to protect. With his son, Telemachus, growing into his role as a leader, Odysseus could rest easy knowing the island would be in capable hands when his time to lead was over. Telemachus, a boy who had once feared the loss of his father, had now come to understand what it meant to lead not through brute force or the weight of history, but through the steady hand of wisdom and empathy. Odysseus had taught him much, though he did not always realize it, shaping the boy into a man who could stand on his own and face the challenges of the future. Telemachus took to his role with a sense of purpose, his eyes now opened to the duties of leadership. The lessons his father had imparted to him through both his words and actions had given him a sense of responsibility beyond the borders of Ithaca. He knew that the island's prosperity was linked not only to the land, but to the hearts of its people, and it was his job to ensure their peace and happiness. His father's legacy was not just one of strength and cunning, but of compassion and understanding, rare gift in a world that often valued conquest over character. The people of Ithaca, too, were marked by the hero's return, and though they celebrated his victories, they did not forget the lesson he had left behind. They had witnessed firsthand the toll that a life of constant battle had taken on their king, and they embraced the quieter, more prosperous future that was now in their grasp. Ithaca was no longer a place defined by war, but by the peace that followed it. The wounds of the past had healed, and from them sprouted a new era of hope and promise. Odysseus, now a figure of myth, watched as his kingdom began to flourish under Telemachus's rule. He knew that his journey had been long and fraught with trials, but it had ultimately led to this momentous moment of peace, of growth, and of a future full of promise for the people he loved. Though the story of his life had come to an end, the story of Ithaca and the legacy of his family was only just beginning. Odysseus stood at the edge of his kingdom, overlooking the rolling hills of Ithaca, the sea shimmering beyond. It was a tranquil sight, one he had longed for throughout his tumultuous journey. Now, after all the years spent at war, trapped by gods, and battling through countless trials, it was this peace that he had fought for. Yet, in the stillness of the moment, Odysseus felt an unease stir within him, a recognition that though his body had returned home, his soul still yearned for the final test, the one that would seal his place among the greatest of men. In many ways, Odysseus's journey had always been a test. From the moment he sailed from Troy, he had encountered gods and monsters, temptations and betrayals, all of which shaped him into the man he had become. He had lived through the pain of separation, the loss of his comrades, and the uncertainty of whether he would ever see his home again. Each trial had demanded something from him, a trick, a sacrifice, or a moment of true understanding. And now, as he stood upon the earth that had once been his battleground, he realized that the final test was not one of strength or skill, but of wisdom. The years had altered him. The warrior who had left Ithaca was no more. The man who stood before his kingdom now was a man tempered by time, by grief, and by reflection. He had learned that even the greatest of victories came at a cost. The lives of those he loved, the lives of those who had perished in his absence, weighed heavily upon him. But through all of it, Odysseus had found the strength not to become consumed by it. Instead, he had become something greater, a king who knew the importance of both power and restraint, of leadership and humility. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Odysseus found himself not on a battlefield, nor in the halls of his palace, but alone gazing out toward the sea, as though it were calling him once more. The call of adventure, the need to understand, had never truly left him. But in that moment, he realized that the greatest discovery was not in the unknown lands he had explored, but in the journey within himself. The test, he now understood, had been to accept his place in the world and embrace the legacy he would leave behind. The wind stirred, as if whispering its approval. Odysseus smiled softly to himself, feeling a deep sense of peace. There would be no more battles to fight, no more monsters to defeat. The last test had been passed not with sword or spear, but with acceptance. His journey, both literal and metaphorical, had come to a close. The world had been forever altered by his actions, but it was now time to let go. The man who had once sought to conquer the world had finally come to understand that the truest conquest was in knowing oneself. And with that understanding, Odysseus could finally rest. The story of Odysseus, though it had long since ended, never truly faded from the hearts and minds of those who lived in the shadow of his legacy. The years rolled on, the sands of time shifting as they always did, but the tale of the great king, the wily hero, and the father who fought to return home endured. It became woven into the fabric of Ithaca's very being, whispered on the winds that swept across the island, told by firesides and in the halls of kings. His trials, his struggles, and his eventual return from the farthest reaches of the world served as a reminder of the strength of the human spirit, of how even in the face of the gods' will and the greatest of obstacles, one could still prevail. The values he embodied, perseverance, wisdom, and an undying devotion to home, continued to resonate with those who came after him. Heroes, both grand and humble, found in his story the courage to face their own battles, to journey through their own dark nights of the soul, and to always look to the horizon for the promise of return. Every generation would find something new in Odysseus's tale, different lessons depending on the era, the needs, and the struggles of the people who listened. The poets, too, kept his memory alive, their songs echoing through time, each telling a part of the story that had yet to be told. The original words of the bards were passed down, but with each telling, the story evolved, shaped by the aspirations and the imaginations of those who told it. It was not just a story of a man's journey home, but of a journey of the heart, of the mind, and of the soul. For some, it was the cleverness of Odysseus that captured their attention, the wit and strategy that allowed him to escape from even the most impossible situations. For others, it was his tenacity, the way he never gave up on the dream of seeing Ithaca again, even when all seemed lost. And for those who felt the weight of their own personal struggles, it was his return to Penelope and Telemachus that struck the deepest chord, the reaffirmation that home, love, and family could endure through the greatest of trials. But what made his story eternal was not simply the victories he achieved or the monsters he conquered. It was the understanding that no journey, no matter how long or difficult, was without purpose. Odysseus had faced the gods themselves, but he had also faced his own demons, and in doing so, he had transformed into more than just a hero. He became a symbol of the resilience of the human spirit, an enduring beacon for all those who would seek to find their way home, wherever that might be. And so, through the centuries, the tale of Odysseus lives on, always relevant, always speaking to the hearts of those who dare to dream and to journey, no matter how far the road may seem. In the years that followed Odysseus's return, the island of Ithaca flourished under his steady hand, a place where peace had taken root once more. The winds that once carried the tales of his struggles now whispered of a prosperous kingdom, one where the scars of the past had healed and new hope blossomed. The tumultuous days of suitors and unrest became mere shadows in the collective memory, fading as the islanders rebuilt their lives and their faith in the future. Ithaca, once the stage for his grand return, now became a reflection of the wisdom he had gained on his long journey. His decisions, tempered by the trials of both the gods and men, shaped the very fabric of the island's governance. Under his rule, the people prospered, their lands fruitful, their lives marked by a renewed sense of purpose. The ships that had once carried him across treacherous seas were now a symbol of Ithaca's strong maritime trade. The island became known for its stability and wisdom, a place where young men and women grew with the knowledge of their heritage and the legacy of a king who had journeyed beyond the edge of the world and returned. The influence of Odysseus, however, went beyond the borders of his kingdom. In every corner of the Greek world, his story was told by bards and scribes alike, evolving over time but always carrying with it the essence of what made him great. The hero who had tricked the gods, fought the monsters, and survived the storms, was also the wise king who had guided his people through their darkest hours. His journey, though it had ended, was never truly over, for its echoes lived on in every tale spun and every generation that rose in the wake of his time. Telemachus, now a man grown, took on the mantle of leadership with the steady hand and thoughtful mind he had inherited from his father. While Odysseus had walked through hell to return to his family, Telemachus sought to protect the peace his father had fought so hard to reclaim. As the new king of Ithaca, Telemachus focused on strengthening ties with neighboring islands, ensuring that the legacy of his father would endure beyond his reign. The prosperity that followed was not only a reflection of Ithaca's good fortune, but a testament to the choices made by Odysseus in the twilight of his reign. His legacy lived on in the hearts of his people, in the governance he left behind, and in the stories told by the firelight. The wisdom that had once saved him from the jaws of monsters and the wrath of gods now shaped the very foundation of his kingdom, ensuring that Ithaca would remain a place of peace and prosperity for generations to come. Though Odysseus's journey had come to an end, the island of Ithaca, shaped by his life and rule, stood as a testament to the lasting power of his influence. Under the rule of Telemachus, Ithaca entered an era of lasting peace, free from the turmoil and discord that had once plagued the island. The land that had been marked by the violent struggles for power and the strife of suitors now flourished in harmony. Telemachus, though young at the time of his father's return, had grown into a wise and capable leader, his decisions influenced by the teachings of Odysseus, who had guided him with both strength and wisdom through the years of uncertainty. Ithaca, once a fragmented kingdom torn apart by conflict, was now unified under the steady hand of its new ruler. Telemachus, with the full support of his people, enacted reforms that ensured the island's prosperity and stability. The alliances forged during Odysseus's reign held firm, and trade flourished, as Ithaca became known as a beacon of peace among the surrounding islands. Its harbours, once frequented by ships of war, were now filled with vessels bearing goods, and the roads that had once echoed with the clamour of conflict were now tranquil, reserved for those who sought peaceful commerce and communication. The memory of Odysseus lived on in the hearts of the people, but Telemachus made sure to carve his own legacy in the history of Ithaca. His leadership was defined by a sense of justice, by the lessons learned from his father's many trials. The kingdom had learned from its past and under Telemachus's rule, those lessons ensured that no external enemy could disrupt the peace again, and no traitor could threaten the stability of the throne. Internally, the people of Ithaca, once divided by the greed and ambition of the suitors, now stood united. The changes made during Odysseus's reign were upheld, creating a more just society where every citizen's rights were respected, and the old ways of corruption and dishonor were banished. The kingdom that Odysseus had returned to was no longer the same. His wisdom, passed down to Telemachus, had brought Ithaca to a golden age, and Telemachus was determined to preserve that peace and stability for as long as he could. Odysseus's legacy, however, remained ever present, both as a shadow over the island and as a light to guide its future. The old king had endured unimaginable trials, faced gods and monsters, and conquered the odds. His son, now ruler of Ithaca, carried that legacy with grace and responsibility. In the years that followed, stories of Odysseus' journey continued to be told by the firesides, passed from generation to generation, inspiring those who would come after. But the legacy of peace, prosperity, and wisdom he left behind was the true testament to the enduring strength of his family and his kingdom. With Ithaca now a land of peace and prosperity, the final chapter of Odysseus's great journey was written, not in tales of warfare and strife, but in the calm, steady rhythm of life that flowed throughout the island. The death of Odysseus marked the end of an era. His passing, though inevitable, cast a shadow over Ithaca as the island mourned the loss of its greatest king. For years, Odysseus had been a figure larger than life itself, a king who had outwitted gods, survived countless trials, and restored his kingdom from the brink of ruin. Yet, with his death, the age of the heroic kings came to a close. The mantle of leadership now passed entirely to Telemachus, his son, who had grown into a wise and capable ruler, ready to uphold the legacy his father had forged. The era that had been defined by men like Odysseus kings, who were not only rulers but warriors, adventurers, and conquerors, began to fade. The world was changing, moving toward a future where the myths and legends of the past would be passed down as stories rather than lived truths. The gods themselves, once deeply entwined in the affairs of men, now seemed distant, their involvement waning as mortal hands took charge of the destinies of kingdoms. Telemachus, though deeply affected by the loss of his father, understood that the time had come for Ithaca to move forward. He knew that the age of heroic kings could not last forever. The world was evolving, and with it, the role of the ruler was shifting. Telemachus's leadership, while rooted in the lessons his father had taught him, would not be defined by battles or the need to prove himself through epic deeds. Instead, it would be measured by his ability to preserve the peace that Odysseus had fought so hard to create, ensuring that the island would continue to thrive long after the stories of their heroic ancestors faded into the past. Yet, the memory of Odysseus could never truly fade. His legacy lived on in the hearts of the people. His name was spoken with reverence, his wisdom invoked in times of trouble. The stories of his journey, the trials he had faced, and the cunning he had shown in overcoming impossible odds would continue to inspire future generations. The heroic kings of the past may have come to an end, but the ideals they had, embodied courage, wisdom, loyalty, and perseverance, remained etched in the very soul of Ithaca. Though the age of kings was over, the island's story was far from finished. With Telemachus at the helm, Ithaca would face a new era, one shaped not by the sword, but by the strength of the community, the quiet determination of the people, and the enduring power of the legacy left by the great Odysseus. His death, while marking the end of an age, had also solidified a foundation upon which the future could be built. And thus, Ithaca moved forward, forever bearing the indelible mark of its legendary king. In the years that followed Odysseus's death, the wisdom he had imparted to his people became the cornerstone upon which Ithaca's future was built. His decisions, made throughout his life, resonated deeply in the hearts of the people, guiding their actions and shaping their governance long after he had passed. Even in his absence, the lessons of resilience, patience, and cunning that he had demonstrated throughout his epic journey echoed through the island, and the people of Ithaca often found themselves turning to the memory of their king for guidance. The wisdom of Odysseus was not merely in his ability to outwit enemies or navigate treacherous seas. It was in his understanding of people, of human nature, and the value of compromise and patience. He knew that leadership required more than strength, it required discernment, the ability to make hard choices for the greater good, even when those choices were not popular. It was this quality, more than any other, that the people of Ithaca now celebrated. Telemachus, having inherited his father's throne, ruled with the same quiet wisdom, drawing from the well of Odysseus's teachings. He did not seek to conquer or to impose his will through force. Instead, he embraced the values his father had shown. He ruled with fairness, understanding that the welfare of the people was the true measure of a king's worth. Odysseus had taught him that a kingdom's strength came not just from military victories, but from the trust and loyalty of its people. In Telemachus's leadership, the island found stability, for he governed with both justice and compassion, knowing that these qualities would secure Ithaca's future. The wisdom of Odysseus was also reflected in the decisions of the common people. They remembered how their king had persevered through unimaginable hardships, how he had never allowed defeat to be the final word in his story. In their daily lives, they embodied the same resilience. They built their homes, farmed their lands, and raised their children with the same spirit of determination that had carried Odysseus through his trials. Even in the face of adversity, the people of Ithaca knew that they could rely on the foundation of wisdom that Odysseus had laid before them. They remembered how their king had taught them to adapt, to use their intellect when faced with obstacles, and to understand that true strength came not from physical prowess, but from the heart and mind. These lessons were passed down through generations, ensuring that Ithaca would continue to flourish as a land of wisdom and resilience. And so, Odysseus's legacy endured not as a story of battles won or enemies defeated, but as a tale of leadership rooted in wisdom, foresight, and a profound understanding of what it meant to be human. His people, forever shaped by his example, carried his memory forward, always guided by the wisdom of their king. Odysseus's journey, a tale woven through the fabric of time, became more than just the story of one man's struggle against the gods and fate. It became a symbola, representation of endurance, strength, and the eternal importance of home. His story, passed down from generation to generation, transcended the boundaries of Ithaca, growing into a legend known far beyond the shores of his homeland. Through the ages, his name became synonymous with the archetype of the hero who, despite insurmountable odds, never gave up on his quest to return home. The core of Odysseus's tale lay in his perseverance, a testament to the unyielding human spirit. Though he faced countless trials, both physical and emotional, he endured them all. From the wrath of Poseidon to the temptations of Circe and the sirens, he faced them with wit and courage, never allowing the dark forces of fate to dictate the end of his journey. It was his resolve to return to Ithaca that carried him through these hardships, reminding everyone who heard his story of the unwavering power of will. But it was not only Odysseus's strength that made his tale legendary. It was the constant pull of home, the idea of a place where one can find rest after struggle, where love and family await. Throughout his journey, this longing for Ithaca kept him anchored to the very purpose of his life. Home, for Odysseus, was more than a physical location. It was a symbol of peace, belonging, and the continuity of life after hardship. His story encapsulated the universal desire for belonging, for the safety of one's own land, and for the warmth of family, which resonated deeply in the hearts of all who heard it. As the centuries passed, Odysseus's journey became immortalized in song, in poetry, and in the hearts of those who drew strength from it. His trials and his triumphs echoed in the lives of countless heroes who followed him. It was no longer just a story of a man's return to his island, but a reflection of the very essence of humanity, the struggle to overcome, the yearning for home, and the power to endure. And so, Odysseus's legacy lived on, not just in Ithaca, but across time. His journey, with its mix of hardship, wisdom, and triumph, transcended the heroism of the ancient world. It became a tale that inspired generations, teaching them that no matter how far one travels or how difficult the road, the true victory lies in the strength to keep moving forward and the eventual return to what truly matters. Odysseus's story remains a cornerstone of heroism, forever etched in the collective memory of humanity.